Every few decades, science rewrites what we thought we knew about reality. But some discoveries refuse to be rewritten. They just sit there, unsolved, staring back at us. Ancient signals from the edge of the universe. Civilizations that vanished overnight. Biological anomalies that defy every known law of nature. These aren't folklore. They aren't conspiracy. They're peer-reviewed, documented, and still utterly unexplained. The deeper researchers dig, the stranger the questions become. So sit back, relax, and let's step together into the space where science ends and the unknown begins. Somewhere beneath the shifting sands and restless tides of the ancient world, there may exist a harbor that once connected civilizations, a port so vital, so strategically positioned, that its loss from memory feels almost deliberate. Its name was Magan. Not a myth, not an invention of romantic historians. Magan appears in cuneiform tablets stretching back over 4,000 years, etched into clay by Sumerian scribes who recorded it with the same matter-of-fact certainty they used for grain counts and cattle inventories. To them, Magan was simply there, a real place, a trading partner, a source of copper and diorite stone that built the monuments of Mesopotamia. And then, gradually, it disappeared. Not with a bang. Not with a flood or a war or a volcanic catastrophe. It simply faded from the record. The earliest references to Magan emerge from the Akkadian period, around 2300 BC, during the reign of Sargon of Akkad, a ruler whose empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Sargon boasted in inscriptions carved for posterity that ships from Magan, Meluha, and Dilmun docked at the wharves of his capital, Akkad. These weren't peripheral traders. They were regular partners in a Bronze Age economic network of remarkable sophistication. Copper from Magan was essential. Without it, Mesopotamia, rich in agriculture but poor in metal, could not arm its soldiers, could not build its temples, could not sustain the machinery of civilization. Magan was not optional. It was foundational. Most scholars today place Magan in the region of modern Oman and the southeastern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. The Hajar Mountains, rich in copper deposits, align convincingly with ancient descriptions. Archaeological digs at sites like Baton Mesar have uncovered smelting furnaces, copper slag, and pottery consistent with what Sumerian texts describe. The evidence on the surface seems settled, but then come the questions that don't quite resolve. If Magan's general location is known, why has no harbor been conclusively identified? A civilization exporting heavy copper ingots and massive blocks of diorite across open sea required serious maritime infrastructure, deep anchorage, loading facilities, navigational knowledge. Where is it? Some researchers point to coastline changes. Sea levels along the Arabian Peninsula have shifted measurably over millennia. A harbor active in 2200 BC might today lie beneath several meters of silt, sand, or shallow water, invisible to surface surveys, waiting for the right sonar scan or excavation season. Others raise a more unsettling possibility. Late Babylonian and Assyrian texts, written centuries after Magan's commercial peak, refer to it in tones that have shifted, less like a trading partner, more like a remembered legend. A place spoken of with a certain distance, as though, by then, even its precise location had grown uncertain. Could the harbor have moved? In the ancient world, ports were not permanent. Political upheaval, silting, or the exhaustion of nearby resources could relocate an entire maritime economy within a generation. What was once called the Harbor of Magan might have been rebuilt, renamed, absorbed into a successor culture. And the original site left to the desert. There are also tantalizing references in late Mesopotamian traditions to Magan possessing knowledge of deep water navigation that contemporary Mesopotamian sailors lacked. This has led some researchers, cautiously and not without controversy, to wonder whether Magan's maritime reach extended further than the Persian Gulf, whether its sailors knew currents and stars that have since been forgotten. It is a speculative leap. But in the study of the ancient world, the most important discoveries have often begun exactly there, with a question that polite scholarship had not yet thought to ask. So what was Magan, really? A province? A maritime empire? A network of ports operating under a single cultural identity? The clay tablets tell us it existed. The copper tells us it mattered. But the harbor, the living, breathing center of it all, remains for now somewhere just beyond the reach of certainty, before moving to the next mystery. If you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. And yet, Magan is not the only civilization the ancient Gulf swallowed quietly into its memory. Not far from those same copper-rich coastlines, another name surfaces in the historical record. Briefly, incompletely, and then almost not at all. The Assyrian scribes who recorded it were not given to poetry. They were administrators, military chroniclers, accountants of empire. When they wrote of an island kingdom in the Gulf, they did so with the same dry precision they applied to tribute lists and campaign reports, which makes its sudden disappearance from their records all the more striking. No dramatic final entry, no note of conquest or catastrophe, just presence and then absence. Picture it as it may once have been. An island rising from warm, shallow water, its shores lined with date palms and fishing settlements, its interior perhaps home to a small but organized society that understood the Gulf's rhythms better than any mainland power could. The sea was not an obstacle to these people. It was a road, and they knew every turn of it. The Assyrian records, fragmentary as they are, suggest this kingdom, or at minimum, this island polity, maintained enough independence and enough strategic value to be noticed by one of the ancient world's most formidable empires. That alone is significant. Assyria did not mention places out of sentiment. If an island appeared in their administrative texts, it was because that island mattered. It controlled something. Access, perhaps. A trade route. A fresh water source in an otherwise arid maritime corridor. Or something less easily categorized. Influence, knowledge, a reputation that traveled further than its geography might suggest. Scholars have proposed several candidate locations. Some point toward the islands of what is now Bahrain, already associated in ancient sources with Dilmun, that other half-mythical, half-real kingdom of the Gulf. Others suggest smaller island clusters further along the Arabian coastline, places that today appear on maps as unremarkable specks of land, but which in a Bronze Age or early Iron Age maritime world would have represented critical waypoints. The difficulty is that the Assyrian references are not abundant. We are working, as historians so often must, with the edges of a picture whose center has not survived. A name here, a tribute notation there, a passing geographical reference in a campaign text that was really about something else entirely. But the edges are enough to raise questions. The kingdom, if kingdom is even the right word for what may have been a more loosely organized maritime authority, appears in records roughly contemporary with the later Assyrian expansions toward the Gulf Coast, somewhere in the period between 900 and 600 BC. This was an era of enormous political turbulence across the Near East. Empires rose, fragmented, and were absorbed. Coastlines that had sustained trading cultures for centuries were reorganized under new authorities. It is entirely possible that this island polity simply became something else. That its people, facing the pressure of Assyrian power or the economic disruption of shifting trade networks, relocated, reorganized, or quietly merged into the cultural fabric of a larger neighbor. History is full of such absorptions, communities that did not vanish so much as transform beyond recognition. But that explanation, satisfying as it is in outline, leaves something unresolved. Because the archaeological record of the Gulf Islands in this period contains its own silences. Sites that show continuous habitation suddenly go quiet. Pottery sequences that should continue simply stop. There are places in Bahrain, on the smaller surrounding islands, and along the eastern Arabian coast where the physical evidence suggests a disruption that administrative assimilation alone does not fully account for. Was there an environmental event? The Gulf is geologically active in ways that are not always visible in the historical record. Shifts in the water table, changes in salinity, the gradual silting of a harbor that once made an island prosperous. Any of these could render a community unviable within a generation or two, without leaving the kind of dramatic evidence that archaeologists can easily identify. Some researchers have explored a more unsettling possibility, that the island or islands in question experienced a rapid depopulation event. Not necessarily violent, but sudden enough to leave infrastructure partially intact and communities partially organized, as though departure was not entirely planned. There are precedents for this in the ancient world. The late Bronze Age collapse, centered further north and west, produced exactly this kind of abandonment pattern across dozens of sites. Whether a related or analogous disruption reached the Gulf Islands in a later period remains an open question. And then there are the fringe theories, offered not as conclusions but as the kinds of speculative threads that serious researchers occasionally pull, carefully, to see what comes loose. Some have noted that certain Gulf Island sites contain structural remains whose purpose is not immediately clear. Platforms, alignments, subsurface features that don't map neatly onto known settlement patterns. A small number of researchers have suggested these may represent ritual or administrative architecture associated with a political culture more sophisticated than the bare Assyrian references imply. Others have pointed to oral traditions preserved in Gulf coastal communities, stories of islands that were once powerful, once central, once the kind of place that kings acknowledged, and wondered whether these traditions carry a faint echo of something real, something older than the traditions themselves know how to name. It is the nature of these mysteries that the evidence leads you to a threshold and then stops. You can see the outline of something significant. You can feel the weight of what the record is not quite saying, but the full picture remains just out of reach, obscured by time, by sea, by the ordinary entropy of civilizations that did not know anyone would one day be looking for them. The Assyrians noticed this kingdom. They thought it worth recording, and then it was gone, not with a proclamation, not with a monument to its own ending, but with the quiet, unhurried disappearance of something that had simply run out of witnesses. What was this island kingdom, and what did it know about the Gulf that we no longer do? The water has had a long time to keep its secrets. It shows no particular sign of giving them up. The Gulf, it seems, was not the only place where ancient power quietly dissolved into landscape. Move eastward, far eastward, past the coastal trading routes in the island polities, past the edge of what most empires considered worth administering, and you arrive somewhere that feels, even today, like the end of the known world. The Gedrosian Desert. It occupies what is now the southwestern corner of Pakistan and the southeastern fringe of Iran. A vast, merciless expanse of gravel plains, jagged rock formations, and dry riverbeds that carry water perhaps once a decade. The heat here is not the romantic heat of sand dunes. It is relentless, structural, the kind that bleaches stone and defeats ambition. Travelers who have crossed it in modern times, with vehicles and GPS and supply chains, still describe it with a particular kind of respect. In antiquity, it nearly destroyed one of the greatest armies ever assembled. In 325 BC, Alexander the Great led his forces through the Gedrosian Desert on the return from his Indian campaign. What followed was not a military defeat, but something arguably worse. A slow, grinding catastrophe of thirst, starvation, and disorientation that killed a significant portion of his army. Ancient sources differ on the numbers, but none of them are gentle. Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus all record the crossing as among the most devastating episodes of Alexander's entire campaign. Men and animals died not from enemy action, but from the desert itself. And yet, here is where the mystery begins to take shape. Alexander did not cross an empty wilderness. The ancient sources hint, and in places state outright, that the Gedrosian region had once supported a functioning administrative network. There were settlements, there were supply depots, there were centers of organization that, at some earlier point, had made movement through this landscape not merely possible, but manageable. Persian imperial records from the Achaemenid period refer to Gedrosia as a satrapy, a governed province, with its own administrative capital and its own obligations to the empire in terms of tribute and military contribution. So where did all of that go? This is the question that sits at the center of the Gedrosian mystery. Not the question of whether civilization existed here, it did, demonstrably, but the question of what happened to its physical infrastructure. The administrative centers that the Achaemenid Empire apparently maintained in this region have never been conclusively identified. No site has been excavated and confirmed as the capital of Gedrosia. No archive, no palace complex, no administrative quarter has emerged from the desert floor with anything approaching the clarity that archaeology has achieved in other parts of the Persian Empire. The mainstream explanation is straightforward enough, and it carries genuine weight. Gedrosia was remote, poorly documented even in its own time, and subject to the kind of environmental conditions that accelerate the decay of mud brick architecture, the dominant building material of the ancient Near East, to near invisibility within a few centuries. A building that collapses in a wet climate leaves rubble. A building that collapses in the Gedrosian desert leaves dust, and the wind takes the dust. And after enough time, there is simply a faint irregularity in the ground that could mean anything or nothing. Add to this the near-total absence of systematic archaeological survey in much of the region, a consequence of political instability, difficult terrain, and the simple fact that more accessible mysteries have drawn more resources, and the silence of the record becomes somewhat less mysterious. We may not have found these centers simply because we have not yet looked in the right places, with the right tools, at the right time. But then come the threads that don't pull cleanly. Some researchers working from satellite imagery and remote sensing data have identified anomalies in the Gedrosian landscape that suggest buried structural remains, rectilinear patterns beneath the surface, subtle variations in soil composition that align with known signatures of ancient habitation. These findings are preliminary, unpublished in many cases, and contested. But they exist, and they raise the possibility that the administrative infrastructure of Achaemenid Gedrosia is not gone so much as hidden, waiting beneath a desert that has had 2,500 years to bury its secrets. There is also the question of the pre-Persian layer. Gedrosia did not begin with the Achaemenid Empire. The region sits at the eastern edge of what archaeologists call the Helmand civilization, a Bronze Age cultural complex that flourished in the 3rd millennium BC, and which produced, at sites like Shari Sokhta in neighboring Sistan, evidence of surprisingly sophisticated urban organization. Whether the administrative traditions of this earlier culture persisted into the Iron Age, shaping how later empires governed the region, is a question that current evidence cannot fully answer. Some scholars have speculated, carefully with appropriate hedging, that the Achaemenid administrative system in Gedrosia may have been built on foundations considerably older than Persia itself, that the capital the Persians used may have been a site already ancient when Cyrus the Great first extended his authority eastward. If that is true, the layers of occupation compressed into the Gedrosian soil may be far deeper and far more complex than anyone has yet had the opportunity to investigate. And then, there is Alexander again. Always Alexander, whose shadow falls across so much of this region's history. Some historians have noted that his disastrous crossing may not have been entirely a failure of planning. There are suggestions in the ancient sources that he expected more support from the coastal regions than he received, and that this expectation was based on the assumption of functioning administrative infrastructure that by 325 BC had already ceased to function. If so, the catastrophe of the Gedrosian crossing may itself be evidence of something that had already gone wrong, a collapse of organization in the region that predated his arrival and that he, fatally, did not account for. What caused that collapse, if it happened? Climate shift? Political fragmentation? The slow withdrawal of imperial investment from a province that was expensive to maintain and strategically peripheral? The desert holds the answer somewhere beneath its surface. It is not a dramatic hiding place. It makes no promises. It simply endures, indifferent to the question, waiting with the patience that only landscapes possess. What lies beneath the Gedrosian plain, and what would it tell us about the limits of ancient empire if we could only find a way to ask? The desert has a way of absorbing what civilizations leave behind. We saw it in the Gedrosian plains, where imperial infrastructure dissolved into gravel and silence. But move westward, back toward the ancient heartlands of the Near East, into the fractured, wind-sculpted landscape of northwestern Arabia, and you encounter a different kind of disappearance. Not the loss of administrative centers or harbor infrastructure, but something more intimate and, in many ways, more unsettling. The loss of a sacred place. The land of Midian occupies, in the historical and religious imagination of the ancient world, a position entirely disproportionate to its size. It appears in some of the oldest textual traditions known to scholarship, in the Hebrew scriptures, in Egyptian records, in the broader documentary fabric of the ancient Near East. The Midianites themselves were not a marginal people. They were traders, pastoralists, metallurgists. They moved through the desert with a confidence that suggested deep knowledge of its water sources, its seasonal rhythms, its hidden geography. And somewhere within that geography, according to traditions that span multiple cultures and centuries, there was a sanctuary. A place of ritual significance so profound that it drew people across vast distances, a site where the sacred and the political converged in the way that only truly important places manage to do. No one has found it. Picture the landscape as it exists today. Northwestern Arabia, the region of Tabuk and al-Bad in modern Saudi Arabia, stretching toward the Gulf of Aqaba, is a place of severe angular beauty. Black basalt fields give way to sandstone escarpments carved by wind into shapes that seem almost deliberate. Dry wadis cut through the terrain like old scars, marking the paths of water that flows perhaps once a generation. It is not an easy landscape to love, but it rewards careful attention, because hidden within it are traces of human presence stretching back further than most people realize. The Midianites emerge most clearly in the record during the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1400 to 1200 BC, though their cultural roots appear to run considerably deeper. Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period reference the peoples of this region in contexts that suggest both conflict and commerce, the two modes through which great powers typically acknowledge their neighbors. The Midianites supplied copper, worked from deposits in the Arabah Valley, and controlled caravan routes that connected Arabia to the Levant and Egypt. They were economically essential in ways that their relatively sparse appearance in the historical record does not adequately reflect. What the record does preserve, with surprising consistency across sources that have no obvious reason to agree with each other, is the idea of a central sacred site. A place associated with fire, with divine encounter, with the kind of religious experience that leaves a permanent mark on cultural memory. The Hebrew scriptures locate Moses' formative encounter with the divine in Midianite territory, at a mountain near a sanctuary in the keeping of a Midianite priest named Jethro. This is not a peripheral detail. It sits at the structural center of one of the most influential religious narratives in human history. Scholars have debated the location of this mountain, variously identified as Sinai, as Jabal al-Lawz in northwestern Arabia, as several other candidates, for well over a century. The debate has not resolved. But what interests researchers working on the Midianite question specifically is not the mountain alone. It is the sanctuary complex that may have surrounded it. Archaeological work at a site called Qaryat in the Tabuk region has produced evidence of a substantial settlement with distinctive painted pottery, now recognized as a marker of Midianite cultural presence, along with what appears to be a large enclosure whose function remains debated. Some researchers interpret it as an administrative center. Others see in its layout the organizational logic of a ceremonial space. The distinction matters enormously, and the evidence, so far, does not clearly resolve it. Further south at Taimai, excavations have revealed a long sequence of occupation with religious structures whose alignments and associated artifacts suggest connections to the broader Midianite cultural sphere. But Taimai is a complex site with many layers, and isolating a specifically Midianite sacred stratum from the accumulated history of a place occupied for millennia is painstaking, slow work. Then there are the more speculative threads. Some researchers working at the intersection of archaeology, textual analysis, and geological survey have proposed that the primary Midianite sanctuary may be located not at any currently excavated site, but somewhere in the volcanic field known as the Harrat K-Bar, a landscape of ancient lava flows, cinder cones, and dramatic geological formations that extends across a significant portion of northwestern Arabia. The volcanic activity of this region, they argue, would have made it a natural focus for fire-associated religious tradition, and the landscape itself would have provided both the isolation and the visual drama that sacred sites in the ancient Near East consistently sought out. It is a compelling geographical argument. It is also, for now, almost entirely without direct archaeological support, largely because the Harrat K-Bar has never been systematically surveyed for ancient sites. The terrain is difficult, access has historically been restricted, and the resources required for serious fieldwork in such an environment have not yet been committed. What has been found in scattered survey work across the broader region are rock inscriptions, some of the oldest Arabian script known, carved into cliff faces and boulders in patterns that suggest waypoints along routes of ritual movement. Pilgrimage paths, possibly. The kind of marked landscape that communities create when they are navigating toward somewhere important. The paths exist. The destination, so far, does not. Somewhere in that ancient volcanic wind-carved terrain, a community once gathered around something they considered sacred enough to travel to, sacred enough to mark their passage toward, sacred enough that the memory of it survived the community itself and passed into the religious inheritance of cultures that came after. What was it exactly? What did people see or experience there that made it worth crossing the desert to reach? And is it still there, buried under basalt and silence, waiting for someone to finally ask the question in the right place? The paths exist, but the destinations remain hidden. We have traced that pattern across deserts and coastlines, through volcanic fields and buried administrative centers. And now the same pattern surfaces again. This time not in the arid interior of Arabia or the silted harbors of the Gulf, but along a coastline so vast, so ancient in its indifference to human ambition, that it has swallowed entire chapters of exploration without leaving so much as a footnote. The western coast of Africa. There is a document, fragile in its survival, extraordinary in its implications, known as the Periplus of Hanno. It is a travel account, or rather a summary of one, describing a Carthaginian expedition that sailed southward along the African Atlantic coast sometime around 500 BC, possibly earlier. Hanno was a navigator and a magistrate of Carthage, the great North African maritime power whose commercial reach extended across the Mediterranean and, apparently, well beyond it. His account, preserved in a Greek translation of what was likely a Phoenician original, describes islands, rivers, volcanoes, strange peoples, and stranger creatures encountered along a coastline that most of the ancient Mediterranean world considered the edge of the navigable world. It is one of the most debated documents in the history of exploration, and buried within it, almost casually, is a reference that has never been satisfactorily explained. At a certain point in the journey, the precise location remains contested, Hanno describes establishing a trading settlement, not merely making landfall or conducting an exchange, but leaving behind a structured presence. A colony, or something functionally similar to one, intended to maintain Carthaginian commercial interest in whatever resources or relationships that particular stretch of coast could provide. And then the account moves on. The settlement is mentioned, and the expedition continues southward, and when the surviving text ends, abruptly, inconclusively, in the way that ancient documents so often do, There is no return to that colony, no report of its fate, no record of resupply, of communication, of the kind of administrative follow-through that a serious colonial investment would typically generate. It simply appears in the record, and then it does not. Picture the coastline as Hanno's sailors would have seen it. West Africa in 500 BC was not empty. It was home to complex, organized societies whose material culture, political structures, and trade networks have been consistently underestimated by scholarship that centered the ancient world too firmly on the Mediterranean. The forests of the West African interior were producing iron at a date that continues to surprise researchers. Agricultural communities along the coast and river systems had been managing their environments with sophistication for millennia. Hanno was not sailing past a wilderness. He was sailing past a world, which raises an immediate and important question. If a Carthaginian trading colony was established on this coast, it would have been established in relationship with the people already there. Commerce requires partners. A settlement that could not negotiate, communicate, and integrate with its immediate neighbors would not have lasted a season, let alone long enough to justify the investment Carthage had made in the expedition. So what happened to that relationship? And what happened to the settlement itself? The mainstream archaeological position is cautious, and reasonably so. No site on the West African coast has been conclusively identified as a Carthaginian colonial outpost. The material culture of Carthage, its distinctive pottery, its religious objects, its architectural preferences, has not appeared in the kind of unambiguous context that would settle the question. This absence is significant, but it is not necessarily conclusive. Carthaginian trading posts were not always built to last. They were sometimes seasonal, sometimes deliberately unobtrusive, designed to facilitate exchange rather than project permanence. A settlement built from local materials, staffed by a small number of traders, and oriented toward relationship rather than domination might leave almost no archaeological trace distinguishable from the surrounding indigenous occupation, particularly after 2,500 years of tropical climate, vegetation growth, coastal erosion, and the simple passage of time. But the absence of evidence has not prevented researchers from looking or from theorizing. Some scholars, working from the geographical descriptions in Hanno's text, have placed the unidentified colony as far south as modern Sierra Leone or even Cameroon. Others argue for locations considerably further north, in what is now Senegal or Guinea-Bissau. The descriptions in the Periplus are vivid but not precise by modern navigational standards. Distances are approximate. Landmarks are described in terms that made sense to a Mediterranean sailor, but resist easy translation onto a modern map. There are also questions about the text itself. The surviving Greek version of the Periplus is considered by most scholars to be a genuine, if compressed, summary of a real Carthaginian document. But compression introduces distortion. Details that were clear in the original may have become ambiguous in translation. The colony that seems casually mentioned may, in the original text, have received far more attention that did not survive the process of summarization. Some researchers have taken a more provocative position. They argue that the trading colony was not abandoned or destroyed but absorbed, that its inhabitants, separated from Carthage by thousands of miles of open ocean and whatever disruptions followed the eventual fall of that empire, simply became part of the communities around them. That Phoenician traders and their descendants live, in some sense, in the genetic and cultural heritage of West African coastal peoples, invisible to conventional archaeology because they stopped being Carthaginian and became something else entirely. It is an idea that sits at the edge of what current evidence can support, but it is not, on its face, implausible. History is full of communities that dissolve not through catastrophe, but through integration, leaving traces too subtle for conventional investigation to recover. Hanno sailed that coast. He left something behind. Whether it lasted a decade or a generation or quietly persisted in forms we no longer recognize, we cannot say with confidence. What did those traders find in that forest-edged, river-cut coastline at the edge of the ancient world's imagination? And is there something still waiting in the soil or the memory of that coast that could finally tell us? Integration, absorption, the quiet dissolution of one culture into another. These are the mechanisms by which so much of the ancient world has been lost to us. But sometimes what disappears is not a people or a settlement or a trading relationship. Sometimes what disappears is something far more deliberate, far more intentional. A dynasty's dead. In the highlands of what is now Yemen, in a landscape of terraced mountains and ancient irrigation systems that still function in places after 3,000 years of use, there existed a civilization of remarkable sophistication and durability. The Sabaean kingdom, known to some through the biblical figure of the Queen of Sheba, known to historians through its inscriptions, its monuments, and its control of the frankincense and myrrh trade routes that connected southern Arabia to the Mediterranean world, was not a minor player in the ancient Near East. It was, for several centuries, one of the wealthiest and most strategically positioned polities on Earth. And yet the tombs of its earliest kings have never been found. Picture the Sabaean heartland as it may once have appeared at the height of its power. The capital, Marib, sat at the edge of the Great Desert, sustained by an engineering marvel, a dam that archaeologists now consider one of the most impressive hydraulic structures of the ancient world, capable of irrigating fields across a vast area of otherwise marginal land. Around it, a city of temples, administrative buildings, and residences that reflected the accumulated wealth of centuries of trade. Caravans arrived and departed in rhythms as regular as tides, carrying resins whose value in the ancient world was, at certain moments, comparable to gold. The kings who built and maintained this system left behind inscriptions. Hundreds of them, carved into stone in a South Arabian script of considerable elegance, recording dedications, military campaigns, administrative decisions, and religious observances. From these inscriptions, scholars have reconstructed a partial king list, a sequence of rulers stretching back into the early 1st millennium BC, and possibly earlier. These were real people, with names, with documented acts, with the kind of historical presence that should, by any reasonable expectation, be accompanied by physical monuments to their memory. In the ancient world, kings built tombs. It was not vanity alone, though vanity certainly played a role. It was theology, politics, and social architecture compressed into stone. A royal tomb was a statement about legitimacy, about the continuity of power, about the relationship between the living dynasty and its divine sanction. Cultures far less wealthy and organized than Saba produced elaborate burial monuments. Egypt is the obvious example, but the same impulse appears in Mesopotamia, in the Levant, in the highlands of Anatolia. So where are the tombs of the early Sabaean kings? The question is not rhetorical. Archaeologists working in Yemen over the past century, interrupted repeatedly by conflict, by access restrictions, and by the devastating ongoing war that has made fieldwork in much of the country impossible, have identified funerary structures in the Sabaean cultural zone. There are tower tombs, shaft graves, and collective burial sites that speak to a developed mortuary tradition. But none of these so far has yielded the kind of royal burial context that the historical record seems to demand. No chamber filled with the regalia of kingship. No inscription identifying the occupant as a mukarrab, the title used by the earliest Sabaean rulers, or as one of the later kings whose names appear in the dedicatory texts. The mainstream explanation begins with the landscape itself. Yemen's highlands are geologically active and agriculturally intensive. Terracing, irrigation, and the continuous occupation of the same productive land over millennia creates a palimpsest of human activity so dense that identifying and isolating specific ancient features becomes extraordinarily difficult. A royal tomb complex that was built, used, and then abandoned 3,000 years ago may lie beneath a village, beneath a terrace wall, beneath centuries of accumulated sediment in a wadi that flooded repeatedly. There is also the question of deliberate concealment. Some ancient cultures hid the tombs of their rulers precisely to protect them, from rival dynasties, from looters, from the kind of desecration that could, in ancient political theology, compromise the legitimacy of a successor's claim. If the early Sabaean kings were buried in locations chosen for obscurity rather than visibility, the absence of obvious funerary monuments becomes less surprising and more intentional. But this raises its own questions. Concealment requires knowledge, a small circle of people who knew where the tombs were and maintained that knowledge across generations. At some point, that knowledge was either written down or it was lost. If it was written down, the record has not survived. If it was lost through the same processes of disruption and discontinuity that characterize so much of southern Arabian history. Some researchers have turned their attention to the desert margins, the transitional zone between the Sabaean agricultural heartland and the great sand desert of the Rub al-Khali to the north and east. In other ancient cultures, royal necropolises were sometimes located at the edge of cultivated land, at the boundary between the world of the living and the world that lay beyond human management. Satellite imagery of this zone has revealed, in places, geometric surface features that do not correspond to any known natural formation. Whether these represent ancient funerary architecture, field systems, or something else entirely, has not been determined. Access for ground-truthing survey has been limited. There are also oral traditions preserved in Yemeni highland communities, fragments of memory about places in the landscape that are considered old in ways that transcend normal historical reckoning. Places where something important happened, or where something important was left, in a time before living memory can reach. These traditions are not evidence, but they are not nothing either. They are the shape of a question that the landscape has been holding for 3,000 years. The early Sabaean kings were powerful enough to reshape rivers, wealthy enough to trade with empires, and organized enough to leave an administrative record that scholars are still decoding. They did not disappear without consequence. Somewhere in those terraced highlands, or at the edge of that immense and silent desert, the first kings of Saba were laid to rest with whatever ceremony their world considered appropriate for the magnitude of their power. Are they still there, undisturbed, waiting in the dark for someone to finally find the right question to ask of the right patch of ground? The highlands of Yemen hold their secrets in stone and silence. But the ancient Near East was never a world of isolated mysteries. It was a web of connections, of campaigns and counter-campaigns, of empires that reached further than their own records sometimes acknowledged. And when we follow that web northward, out of the frankincense highlands and into the vast, sun-bleached interior of the Arabian Peninsula, we encounter something that the most powerful military machine of the ancient world apparently considered significant enough to march against, and which history has since almost completely forgotten. An Oasis kingdom, unassuming in description, extraordinary in implication. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, at its height between roughly 900 and 600 BC, was an administrative and military phenomenon without parallel in the ancient world up to that point. Its kings campaigned relentlessly, and they recorded those campaigns with a thoroughness that modern historians find both invaluable and occasionally frustrating, because Assyrian royal inscriptions were also propaganda, shaped to glorify the king and minimize inconvenient complications. What they mention for a reason. What they describe as a serious military objective was, by definition, worth taking seriously. In several Neo-Assyrian campaign texts, scholars have identified references to Arabian Oasis settlements that resisted, negotiated with, or were subjugated by Assyrian forces moving into the northern and central Arabian interior. Most of these can be tentatively identified with known sites, but among them, recurring in contexts that suggest particular strategic importance, is a name, or a cluster of names across different texts, that resists clean identification with any currently known archaeological site. Picture where this kingdom may have existed. The northern Arabian interior in the first millennium BC was not the uniformly barren landscape it might appear on a modern map. It was crosshatched with trade routes connecting the incense-producing south with the markets of Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt. Along these routes, at intervals determined by the availability of water, Oasis settlements had developed into something considerably more than rest stops. They were toll points, storage facilities, banking centers in the practical sense of places where debts were recorded and goods held against future exchange. The caravan economy of ancient Arabia was sophisticated, and the settlements that served it reflected that sophistication. An oasis community that controlled a critical junction on these routes would have accumulated wealth disproportionate to its size. It would have developed relationships, political, commercial, matrimonial, with the tribal confederations of the surrounding desert, giving it a sphere of influence that extended far beyond its physical footprint. And it would, inevitably, have attracted the attention of any empire ambitious enough to want control of the revenues flowing through it. The Assyrians were exactly that ambitious. Texts from the reigns of Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib all contain references to Arabian campaigns that pushed into territory the Assyrian military found genuinely challenging. The desert was not their element. Their logistics, optimized for river valleys and agricultural plains, struggled in an environment where water sources were sparse, distances were enormous, and the local populations could simply melt into landscapes that Assyrian heavy infantry could not effectively pursue them across. That they campaigned there anyway, repeatedly across multiple reigns, suggests the prize was considered worth the difficulty. And among the objectives mentioned in these texts, the unidentified Oasis kingdom appears with a frequency and a specificity that implies it was not a minor target. So why can't we find it? The mainstream archaeological answer points to the limitations of survey work in the northern Arabian interior. Systematic archaeological investigation of this region is relatively recent, still incomplete, and has been complicated by the same combination of political, logistical, and resource constraints that hampers work across much of the Arabian Peninsula. Sites that were significant in the Iron Age may be buried under later occupation, may have been quarried for building material in subsequent centuries, or may simply not have been recognized for what they are during the limited survey work that has been conducted. There is also the nature of oasis settlement itself. An oasis community builds differently from a river valley city. Its architecture is adapted to different constraints, its material culture shaped by different trade connections, and its spatial organization determined by the specific geography of its water source. Identifying such a site from surface survey alone, without excavation, is genuinely difficult, particularly when the site may have been occupied and modified across many centuries, with later layers obscuring earlier ones. But some researchers have pushed beyond this practical explanation toward something more structurally interesting. They have noted that the Assyrian references to this kingdom describe it in terms that suggest a degree of political organization beyond what a simple oasis trading post would require. There are hints of a ruling structure, of a defined territory, of the kind of institutional continuity that distinguishes a kingdom, however small, from a settlement. If this is accurate, the material remains of such an entity should be more visible, not less. Unless, some have suggested, the kingdom's power was deliberately distributed, spread across multiple smaller sites connected by tribal and commercial relationships, rather than concentrated in a single capital that could be identified, besieged, and destroyed. A network kingdom, in effect, rather than a centralized one. Such an entity would be extraordinarily difficult for an Assyrian campaign to neutralize comprehensively, which might explain why the texts suggest repeated rather than conclusive military engagement. And it would be equally difficult for modern archaeology to identify, because there would be no single site whose destruction or abandonment marks a clear endpoint. The kingdom would not fall. It would simply gradually cease to cohere, its network dissolving as trade routes shifted and the political conditions that had sustained it changed beyond adaptation. Satellite survey of the northern Arabian interior has, in recent years, revealed networks of ancient tracks, water management features, and potential settlement sites that ground survey has not yet investigated. Some of these align in their geographical distribution with the kind of route-controlling position that the Assyrian texts imply. The Oasis Kingdom may not be one place waiting to be found. It may be a pattern waiting to be recognized, scattered across a landscape that has been hiding it, quietly and without drama, for 2,500 years. What would it mean for our understanding of ancient Arabian political complexity if we found it? And what else might we discover in that patient and unexamined desert that we have not yet thought to look for, a pattern waiting to be recognized? That is what we left behind in the northern Arabian interior. The possibility that an entire kingdom existed not as a single place, but as a distributed network, invisible to conventional investigation precisely because of how it was organized. And now, as we move southward and eastward, deeper into the Arabian Peninsula, that same idea takes on a new and more unsettling dimension. Because here, on the fringes of the largest sand desert on Earth, there are settlements that we know existed. Not kingdoms inferred from campaign texts, not trading colonies suggested by a single ambiguous document. Actual settlements with structures and artifacts and evidence of sustained human occupation. And they disappeared, and we do not know why. The Rub al-Khali, the Empty Quarter. The name is both geographical description and quiet warning. It covers approximately 650,000 square kilometers of southern Arabia, sprawling across modern Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates in a landscape of dunes that in places rise to the height of skyscrapers, separated by salt flats and gravel plains of absolute, almost aggressive desolation. It is one of the least hospitable environments on the planet's surface, and it has been that way, more or less, for the last several thousand years. But it was not always so inhospitable at its edges. The fringe zones of the Rub al-Khali, the transitional areas where the Great Desert meets the slightly less severe terrain of the surrounding regions, show clear evidence of Iron Age occupation. Settlements dating broadly to the period between 1200 and 300 BC have been identified through a combination of ground survey, satellite imagery, and targeted excavation at sites scattered across this marginal zone. These were not temporary camps or seasonal stopping points. The structural remains, where they survive, suggest permanent or semi-permanent occupation. Buildings of stone and mud brick, water management features including wells and small-scale irrigation systems, and material culture consistent with communities engaged in both pastoralism and agriculture. They were making a life in one of the hardest places on Earth to make a life. And for a time, apparently, they succeeded. The question that archaeology has not yet satisfactorily answered is why they stopped. The evidence for abandonment is, in most cases, relatively clear. Occupation sequences that show continuous habitation across several centuries simply end. There is no obvious destruction layer, no evidence of burning, of violent disruption, of the kind of sudden catastrophic event that leaves unmistakable signatures in the archaeological record. The settlements were not destroyed, they were left, and whatever caused their inhabitants to leave did not, apparently, give them time or reason to return. The mainstream explanation centers on climate. The Arabian Peninsula experienced significant climatic fluctuation across the first millennium BC, with periods of relative humidity, enough to sustain marginal agriculture, giving way to the more arid conditions that characterize the region today. If the fringe zones of the Rub al-Khali became progressively drier across this period, the agricultural and pastoral systems that sustained these settlements would have come under increasing stress. Water sources that had been reliable for generations might have become seasonal, then intermittent, then absent. The communities that depended on them would have had little choice but to move. This is a coherent and well-supported explanation as far as it goes. Paleoclimatic data from the region, drawn from lake sediments, speleothems, and isotopic analysis of ancient soils, does indicate an aridification trend broadly consistent with this timeline. Climate-driven abandonment is not speculative. It is documented in analogous situations across the ancient world. But the details, as always, complicate the picture. Some of the abandoned sites on the Rub al-Khali fringe show evidence of abrupt rather than gradual departure. The distinction matters. A community responding to slow climatic deterioration typically shows an archaeological signature of progressive abandonment, declining investment in infrastructure, reduction in settlement size, evidence of population thinning over multiple generations before final departure. What some of these sites show instead is a pattern more consistent with relatively rapid abandonment. Structures that appear to have been in active use until close to the moment they were left. Rapid abandonment in the absence of violence suggests something more sudden than a multi-generational climate trend. A single catastrophic drought, perhaps. The kind of multi-year rainfall failure that even relatively resilient communities cannot survive without external support. Or a disruption to the trade networks that supplemented local food production, removing the economic buffer that allowed marginal communities to persist through difficult seasons. Some researchers have raised a more geologically oriented possibility. The Rub' al-Khali and its fringe zones sit above a complex subsurface geology that includes significant aquifer systems. Changes in groundwater availability, driven by tectonic activity, by shifts in regional hydrology, or by the cumulative effect of human extraction over centuries, could have affected surface water sources in ways that would not be immediately visible in standard paleoclimatic proxies. A well that failed not because of reduced rainfall, but because of a shift in the underlying water table would leave no obvious trace in the sedimentary record. And then there are the sites that have not yet been properly investigated. Anomalies identified through satellite survey in the deeper fringe zones that suggest settlement activity in areas currently considered too arid to have supported permanent occupation even in wetter periods. If confirmed, these sites would require a significant revision of current models of both ancient Arabian climate and ancient Arabian settlement patterns. They remain, for now, points on a map rather than places with names and histories. The people who lived on the edge of the empty quarter during the Iron Age were not marginal in the sense of being unimportant. They were marginal in the geographical sense of occupying a boundary zone, between desert and cultivated land, between the known world and the unknown, between the conditions that support human life and the conditions that defeat it. They found a way to exist in that boundary for centuries, and then, quietly, they did not. What pushed them past the threshold? And in the deeper, unsurveyed reaches of that fringe, are there communities whose stories we have not yet even begun to read? Thresholds. That is what we keep returning to. Communities that existed at the edge of what was possible, that found ways to sustain themselves in marginal zones, and that disappeared when some combination of forces pushed them past the point of recovery. The Rub' al-Khali fringe settlements were one expression of that pattern. But as we move eastward, into the interior of the Omani Peninsula, we encounter a different kind of threshold entirely. Not the threshold between desert and cultivated land. The threshold between the ancient world's industrial ambitions and the landscapes that fed them. Oman's interior is a place of severe, angular beauty. The Hajar Mountains run in a great arc across the northeastern part of the country, their ridgelines fractured and mineral-stained, their valleys cutting deep channels through rock that in places exposes the geological history of the Arabian Plate in vivid, almost didactic cross-section. It is not an obviously welcoming landscape, but beneath its surface, distributed across a zone that stretches for hundreds of kilometers through the mountain system and into the foothills beyond, lies one of the ancient world's most significant concentrations of copper ore. And the ancient world knew it. We established at the very beginning of this exploration that Magan, the copper-supplying civilization referenced in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, is most convincingly located in this region. The scholarly consensus on that broad identification is relatively firm. What is considerably less firm is the detailed picture of how copper production and trading was actually organized across Oman's interior, where the specific settlements that manage this industry were located, and what happened to the communities whose labor and knowledge sustained one of the Bronze Age world's most critical supply chains. The excavated evidence is remarkable in what it reveals and tantalizing in what it withholds. Sites like Maysar, in the Wadi Samad region, have produced smelting furnaces, slag heaps, copper ingots, and tools that confirm large-scale copper production during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. The scale of production at some of these sites is genuinely impressive. The slag deposits at certain locations represent the residue of smelting operations conducted over centuries, processing or volumes that supplied not just local needs, but the export demands of distant civilizations. But Mesar and the handful of other excavated sites represent a fraction of what survey work suggests exists across the Omani interior. Remote sensing and ground survey conducted over the past several decades have identified dozens, in some estimates, considerably more than 100, additional sites showing surface evidence consistent with ancient copper working. Most of these have never been excavated. Most have been visited briefly, noted, and added to a growing inventory of places that deserve investigation and have not yet received it. What would a comprehensive picture of this industry look like if we had the evidence to construct it? Almost certainly, it would reveal a network, a distributed system of mining sites, smelting centers, intermediate settlements, and trading posts connected by routes that moved ore, fuel, finished metal, food, and people across a landscape that required careful management to traverse. The logistics of Bronze Age copper production at the scale Oman apparently sustained were not simple. Smelting requires not just ore, but fuel, enormous quantities of charcoal, which in a semi-arid mountain environment means systematic management of woodland resources across a wide area. It requires water. It requires specialized knowledge transmitted across generations. It requires, in other words, a social infrastructure as complex and carefully maintained as the physical one. That social infrastructure has left traces that archaeology has only partially recovered. The settlements associated with copper production in Oman's interior range from small, apparently specialized sites, little more than a cluster of structures around a smelting installation, to more substantial communities that show evidence of diverse economic activity, craft production, and the kind of material culture that implies connection to broader trade networks. Some of these larger sites contain imported ceramics and other objects that confirm direct or indirect contact with Mesopotamia, with the Indus Valley, and with the broader Gulf trading world. And then, across the latter part of the second millennium BC, the evidence for this network begins to thin. The thinning is not uniform, and it is not instantaneous. Different sites show different trajectories. Some appear to have been abandoned relatively abruptly, with occupation ending within what the archaeological record suggests was a fairly short period. Others show evidence of continued, if reduced, activity extending into the early first millennium BC. A few sites demonstrate reoccupation after apparent gaps, communities returning to places that had been left, for reasons and under circumstances that the current evidence does not clarify. The mainstream explanation for the broader pattern of decline centers on the collapse of the Bronze Age trading networks that had sustained Omani copper production at its peak. The late second millennium BC was a period of system-wide disruption across the ancient Near East, the so-called Bronze Age collapse that affected societies from Greece to Mesopotamia and whose causes remain debated among scholars. If the demand for Omani copper contracted sharply because the civilizations that had been buying it were themselves in crisis, the economic rationale for maintaining large-scale production in Oman's challenging interior environment would have diminished correspondingly. But this explanation accounts for the broad pattern without explaining the specific variations. Why did some sites continue while others were abandoned? Why do certain locations show evidence of deliberate, careful closure, artifacts stored, structures secured, while others suggest more precipitate departure? Was there a period during which the industry contracted to a smaller number of more efficient or better positioned centers? And if so, where were those centers, and what ultimately became of them? Some researchers have suggested that the knowledge systems associated with Omani copper production, the specific understanding of ore sources, smelting techniques, and logistical management that made the industry function, may have been more fragile than the physical infrastructure implies. Specialized knowledge, transmitted through apprenticeship and practice rather than written documentation, can be lost with surprising speed when the social continuity that carries it is disrupted. A generation of conflict, famine, or forced migration might be enough to sever the chain of transmission irreparably. If that knowledge was lost, it was lost with the people who held it, in settlements whose locations we have not yet fully mapped, in a landscape that has been quietly preserving its secrets beneath a thin layer of desert soil for 3,000 years. What did those smelters know about the mountain's ore that we have not yet rediscovered? And in the unmapped sites that remote sensing continues to reveal across Oman's interior, what evidence of their world still waits, undisturbed, for the excavation season that has not yet come? Knowledge once lost leaves a silence that is difficult to distinguish from absence. The copper smelters of Oman's interior carried their understanding of ore and fire and mountain into a darkness that archaeology is only beginning to penetrate. But knowledge was not the only thing the ancient Arabian world moved across its landscapes. It moved goods. It moved people. It moved the accumulated commercial energy of civilizations that understood, with extraordinary clarity, that wealth flows along routes, and that whoever controls the routes controls everything that travels them. Which brings us to a city, or rather, to the ghost of what came before one. Qaryat al-Faw sits at the edge of the Rub al-Khali in what is now the southwestern corner of Saudi Arabia, at a point where the Great Desert meets the foothills of the Tawaik Escarpment. It is, by any measure, one of the most significant archaeological sites on the Arabian Peninsula, a caravan city that flourished roughly between the 4th century BC and the 4th century AD, serving as the capital of the ancient Kindite kingdom and a major node in the incense trade routes that connected southern Arabia to the markets of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. Excavations at Qaryat al-Faw, conducted primarily by Saudi archaeologists from King Saud University across several decades, have revealed a city of genuine sophistication. Residential quarters, markets, temples, a necropolis, and an irrigation system capable of sustaining agriculture in an environment that would otherwise not permit it. The material culture recovered from the site reflects commercial connections that span the ancient world. Coins, ceramics, textiles, and luxury objects whose origins range from the Mediterranean coast to the Indian subcontinent. This was not a peripheral settlement. It was a hub, a place where the threads of the ancient world's long-distance commerce converged and were redistributed. But Qaryat al-Faw did not emerge from nothing. The routes it controlled, the water sources it exploited, the geographical position it occupied, none of these became significant only when the Kindite kingdom established its capital there. The junction of desert edge and mountain fringe that made Qaryat al-Faw viable as a caravan city was a geographical fact long before the first Kindite king arrived. And the incense trade, whose management sustained the city, was not a first millennium BC innovation. It was ancient. Ancient in the sense that frankincense and myrrh appear in Egyptian records from the 3rd millennium BC, that Mesopotamian religious practice required these resins for centuries before Qaryat al-Faw existed, that the demand which made the routes profitable had been generating commercial traffic across the Arabian interior for well over 1,000 years before the city's foundation. Someone was managing that traffic before the Kindites. Some settlement, some community, some organizational structure was occupying or controlling this critical geographical junction during the long centuries that preceded Qaryat al-Faw's documented history. And that predecessor has not been found. The search for it is complicated by the nature of the site itself. Qaryat al-Faw is a substantial city covering a considerable area, and the centuries of occupation it represents have created the kind of deep, complex stratigraphy that makes reaching earlier layers both technically demanding and archaeologically risky. Excavating down through a well-preserved later city to find what lies beneath it requires resources, time, and a carefully managed balance between recovering earlier evidence and preserving the later record that is already known and documented. What limited stratigraphic investigation has been conducted at and around the site suggests that occupation in the area predates the Kindite period. Surface surveys in the broader region have identified material, pottery forms, lithic scatters, architectural traces, consistent with activity during the early 1st millennium BC and possibly earlier. But the picture is fragmentary, and the relationship between these earlier traces and any organized settlement that might constitute a genuine predecessor to the caravan city remains unclear. The geographical logic is compelling, however. A water source in a desert-edge location, at a junction of routes connecting the incense-producing highlands of Yemen and Oman to the markets of the north, would have been exploited by organized communities as long as those routes carried significant commercial traffic. The idea that this particular spot sat unoccupied or unmanaged through the height of the Bronze Age incense trade, when Mesopotamian demand for southern Arabian resins was already substantial, is difficult to reconcile with what we know about how ancient commercial networks operated. Some researchers have proposed that the predecessor settlement may not lie directly beneath Qaryat al-Faw itself, but at a nearby location, a slightly different point on the same water system, or a position along the route that offered advantages under the environmental and political conditions of an earlier period that no longer applied by the time the Kindites arrived. Settlement locations shift across centuries in response to changes in water availability, in route alignment, and in the security conditions that determine where communities can viably establish themselves. If the predecessor occupied a different physical location, it might be identifiable through the kind of systematic regional survey that the area around Qaryat al-Faw has not yet fully received. Satellite imagery of the broader zone has revealed features that merit ground investigation: possible structural remains, ancient track alignments, water management features whose relationship to the known city is not yet understood. There are also the inscriptions. Qaryat al-Faw has produced South Arabian inscriptions in considerable quantity, some of which contain historical references that scholars are still working to fully interpret. A small number of these texts appear to reference earlier conditions, earlier political arrangements, earlier place names that may preserve traces of the predecessor community's identity. The epigraphic evidence is not conclusive, but it suggests that the people of Qaryat al-Faw knew they were not the first to occupy this ground, and that whatever came before them was significant enough to merit acknowledgement. A city that knows it has a predecessor, but whose predecessor we cannot find. A route that was ancient when the city was young, carrying the weight of commerce and civilization across a desert that has always asked more of travelers than most landscapes dare. What was here before the Kindites built their capital? What community first recognized the value of this junction, first managed the water, first established the relationships with the desert tribes that made permanent occupation possible? The ground beneath Qaryat al-Faw may hold that answer. It has simply not yet been asked in the right way. The ground beneath Qaryat al-Faw keeps its earliest secrets sealed beneath layers of later occupation, waiting for the question to be asked in the right way. But sometimes the question has been asked. Sometimes the excavation has reached the earlier layers. The pottery has been cataloged, the structures have been mapped, the occupation sequence has been established with reasonable confidence. And the mystery is not one of absence. It is one of presence followed by something that looks, in the archaeological record, uncomfortably like collapse. Move northeast from the Arabian Peninsula, across the Iranian Plateau, into a landscape that sits at the intersection of three modern nations and at the center of one of the ancient world's most productive and least understood river systems. Here, on the border zone between modern Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, there is a body of water whose name carries a certain geographical poetry, even in translation: Lake Hamun. It is, in most years, a shallow endorheic lake, a lake with no outlet to the sea, fed by the Helmand River as it descends from the mountains of central Afghanistan and spreads across the flat, semi-arid basin of Sistan. In wet years, the lake and its associated wetlands expand dramatically, supporting agriculture, fisheries, and human settlement across a wide area. In dry years, it contracts, sometimes to near disappearance, leaving behind cracked mudflats and salt deposits that speak plainly of absence. This variability is ancient. It has been shaping human decisions in the Sistan Basin for as long as people have lived here. And people have lived here for a very long time. The settlement record around Lake Hamun extends back to the Neolithic period, but it reaches its greatest known complexity and density during the Bronze Age, roughly the 3rd and early 2nd millennia BC, when the Sistan Basin supported what archaeologists now recognize as one of the most significant urban concentrations in the prehistoric world east of Mesopotamia. The site of Shari Sokhta, the burnt city, sits on the western edge of this basin and has produced evidence of a community that at its peak housed tens of thousands of people, engaged in long-distance trade across an enormous geographical range, and developed craft industries, including textile production, lapidary work, and metallurgy, of a sophistication that continues to surprise researchers with each new excavation season. Shari Sokhta did not stand alone. Survey work across the broader Sustan Basin has identified a network of smaller sites, towns, villages, specialized production centers, that together suggest a regional system of considerable organizational complexity. This was not a single city in an empty landscape. It was a settled, managed, productive region whose population and economic output placed it among the significant civilizations of its era. And then, across the latter part of the second millennium BC, this network contracted sharply. Shari Sokhta itself, after centuries of continuous occupation and growth, was effectively abandoned sometime around 1800 BC, possibly earlier in some areas of the site. The smaller settlements in the surrounding region show a similar pattern, occupation sequences that had been building steadily toward greater complexity and density simply reverse, thin, and in many cases end. By the early first millennium BC, a basin that had sustained a substantial urban population was supporting a fraction of what it had held during the Bronze Age peak. The mainstream explanation begins, as it so often does in this part of the world, with water. The Helmand River system is sensitive to upstream conditions in ways that can produce dramatic downstream effects. Changes in rainfall patterns across the Afghan highlands, shifts in the timing and volume of snowmelt, alterations in the river's channel behavior as it crosses the broad alluvial fan of the Sistan Basin. Any of these can affect the availability and distribution of water across the lake and wetland system that sustained Bronze Age agriculture in the region. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the latter part of the 3rd millennium BC and the early 2nd millennium were characterized by increasing aridity across much of Southwest and Central Asia, the same broad climatic deterioration that may have contributed to disruptions in the Indus Valley civilization, in the Akkadian Empire, and in the early Bronze Age societies of the Levant. If the Helmand delivered less water, the lake would have contracted. If the lake contracted, the agricultural margin would have shrunk. If the agricultural margin shrunk, the population the basin could support would have declined, not necessarily through catastrophe, but through the accumulated pressure of reduced harvests, increased competition for remaining resources, and the gradual erosion of the economic surplus that had sustained urban complexity. This is a coherent model. It is supported by proxy data, consistent with broader regional patterns, and structurally similar to explanations that have been applied to other roughly contemporaneous collapses across the ancient world. But the Sistan case has features that this model does not entirely account for. The decline of the settlement network around Lake Hamun was not uniform across the basin. Some sites were abandoned while others continued, at reduced scale, for centuries longer. The pattern of which sites persisted and which were left suggests a reorganization of settlement rather than a simple overall contraction, as though communities were making strategic decisions about where to concentrate their reduced population, which water sources to prioritize, which positions in the landscape offered the best combination of agricultural potential and defensibility. Defensibility. That word appears in the literature with a frequency that raises its own questions. Some of the sites that show continued occupation into the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BC are positioned in ways that suggest security was a concern. Elevated locations, sites with natural barriers, places where a small population could maintain itself against external pressure more effectively than in the open agricultural lowlands that had sustained the Bronze Age network. What external pressure? The late Bronze Age across this entire region was a period of significant population movement. Pastoral and semi-nomadic groups whose territories overlapped with the settled agricultural zones were responding to the same climatic pressures as the farming communities, and competition for remaining productive land and water sources would have intensified as conditions deteriorated. Some researchers have proposed that the contraction of the Sistan settlement network reflects not just environmental stress, but a shift in the balance of power between settled and mobile populations, a shift that the environmental deterioration triggered but did not by itself fully determine. Others have pointed to evidence of fire at certain sites, not the routine burning that occurs in any occupied settlement, but concentrated, structural burning of the kind that can indicate deliberate destruction. The evidence is not uniform, and its interpretation is contested. But it suggests that for at least some communities in the network, the end was not quiet. And then there are the deeper questions that current investigation has not yet reached. Beneath the well-documented Bronze Age layers at several Sistan Basin sites, there are traces of earlier occupation, material that hints at a pre-urban phase of settlement around Lake Hamun, whose character and extent are not yet understood. If the Bronze Age network had predecessors of its own, those predecessors may have experienced their own cycles of growth and contraction, their own responses to the lake's variability, their own organizational experiments that the later urban communities built upon or diverged from. The lake has expanded and contracted dozens of times since the last Bronze Age farmer walked its shore. Each cycle has reworked the sediments, redistributed the surface evidence, and buried the record a little deeper. What did the people of Shari Sokta understand about living with a lake that could disappear? And what did they do when they finally realized it would not come back the way it had before? The people of Shari Sokta made their calculations about water and survival, about which ground to hold and which to leave, and in the end, the lake made the decision for them. That tension between human organization and the landscapes that both enable and defeat it runs through every mystery we have explored in this journey. But as we move further north and east, deeper into the continental interior of Central Asia, that tension takes on a new and more dramatic physical form. Because here, the people did not simply build settlements near water sources and hope for the best. They built fortresses on hilltops. They carved walls into cliffsides. They constructed with enormous investment of labor and organizational energy, a network of defensive positions across a landscape that stretches between the lower reaches of the Amudarya River and the edges of the Kizilkum and Karakum deserts. And then they walked away from all of it. Chorasmia. The name itself has an archaic weight to it, a sound that belongs to a world considerably older and stranger than the one we inhabit. It describes a region that corresponds roughly to the area straddling the modern border between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, centered on the delta zone where the Amudarya, the ancient Oxus, spreads across a flat, fertile plain before losing itself in the shrinking Aral Sea to the north. It is not a landscape that announces its significance. The terrain is largely flat, the horizons wide and featureless, the light in summer a hard, bleaching white that flattens perspective and makes distance difficult to judge. But rising from this flatness, at intervals that suggest deliberate placement rather than geographic accident, are the remnants of structures that stop you when you first encounter them in the archaeological literature. Mud brick fortresses, some of them covering areas measured in hectares, their walls in places still standing to considerable height despite millennia of abandonment and erosion. Towers, gateways, internal divisions that speak to sophisticated military architecture. And beneath the fortresses, or clustered around their bases, the traces of associated settlements whose inhabitants lived under the shadow of walls, built for purposes that go beyond simple community defense. The Chorasmian fortress network was first systematically investigated by Soviet archaeologists in the mid-20th century, most notably through the work of Sergei Tolstov, whose expeditions across the region produced a foundational body of documentation that subsequent researchers have built upon, revised, and in some cases, significantly reinterpreted. Tolstov identified dozens of fortified sites dating across a broad chronological range, from the early 1st millennium BC through the early centuries of the 1st millennium AD, and proposed an ambitious framework for understanding Chorasmian civilization as a coherent political and cultural entity with its own developmental trajectory. That framework has been substantially refined since Tolstov's time, but the core observation remains valid and remarkable. Chorasmia sustained for roughly a millennium a density of fortified sites without close parallel in the surrounding region. This was not a landscape of isolated strongholds. It was a system, an integrated network of positions that, taken together, suggest a level of territorial organization and military investment that implies a state or something functioning very much like one. The verified historical record of Chorasmia is frustratingly sparse for the earlier periods. Persian Achaemenid sources mention Chorasmia as a satrapy, confirming its existence as a recognized political entity by the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Greek sources, following Alexander's campaigns in the region, add a little more. But for the earlier phases of the fortress network, the initial construction, the organizational logic behind the placement of specific sites, the political structure that mobilized the labor required to build and maintain these fortifications, the textual record offers almost nothing. Archaeology must carry the weight that documents cannot. What the archaeological evidence suggests in broad outline is a society that felt for an extended period genuinely threatened. Fortifications of the scale and sophistication seen in Chorasmia are not built as prestige projects or administrative symbols. They are built by communities that have specific, concrete reasons to invest enormous resources in defense. The question of what those reasons were, who or what the Chorasmians were defending against across the multiple centuries during which they maintained and expanded their fortress network, is one that current evidence answers only partially. The steppe frontier to the north and east is the obvious candidate. Chorasmia sat at the agricultural margin of the ancient world, at the point where the irrigated, settled civilization of the Amudarya Delta met the vast, mobile pastoral world of the Eurasian steppe. The relationship between these two worlds, settled and nomadic, agricultural and pastoral, fortress building and tent dwelling, was complex, variable, and frequently violent. Steppe confederations whose military capabilities consistently challenged even the largest ancient empires would have represented a permanent and serious threat to Chorasmian communities, dependent on irrigation infrastructure that was both essential and vulnerable. But some researchers have noted that the distribution of fortifications within Chorasmia is not simply oriented toward the steppe frontier. Some sites are positioned in ways that suggest internal territorial control, monitoring and managing the movement of people and goods within the agricultural zone itself, rather than simply defending against external attack. This has led to proposals that the fortress network served a dual function, simultaneously defending against external threat and projecting internal political authority across a population that may not have been entirely unified under a single power. Then come the questions about abandonment, because the fortresses were abandoned, most of them, and the timing and pattern of that abandonment is not uniform in ways that a simple external conquest would produce. Some sites show evidence of violent destruction, burning, demolition, the kind of physical signature that suggests forced rather than voluntary departure. Others appear to have been carefully, almost methodically emptied, objects removed, certain architectural features deliberately dismantled, as though the departure was planned and organized rather than precipitate. A third group shows evidence of gradual decline, with occupation thinning over generations before finally ending without obvious drama. 3 different patterns of abandonment across a network that had, for centuries, functioned as a coherent system. What does that variety tell us? It suggests, at minimum, that the end of the Chorasmian fortress network was not a single event, but a process, extended, uneven, and driven by factors that affected different parts of the system differently. Climate change in the Amudarya Delta region during the early centuries of the first millennium AD is well documented. Shifts in the river's channel behavior that affected the irrigation systems on which Chorasmian agriculture depended could render entire sections of the agricultural zone unviable within decades. Political disruption from the movement of new powers across Central Asia, the Kushans, the Hephthalites, the early Islamic expansion, would have reorganized the strategic landscape in ways that made some fortress positions obsolete while threatening others more acutely. And yet, beneath both of these documented pressures, some researchers have identified what they describe as a prior weakening, a deterioration in the organizational capacity of Chorasmian society that preceded the external shocks, and may have made the system more vulnerable to them than it would otherwise have been. The evidence for this is subtle, drawn from changes in construction quality, in the maintenance of irrigation infrastructure, in the material culture of later occupation layers. It suggests an internal dynamic whose precise nature and causes remain debated. Were the Chorasmians defeated, or did they, in some slower, more fundamental sense, simply exhaust the conditions that had made their fortress civilization possible. The mud brick walls are still there, eroding increment by increment under Central Asian sun and wind, holding their answer in the patient way that only ruins can. What would those walls tell us if we could read every layer of their long, complicated silence? The mud brick walls of Chorasmia hold their silence in a language we can almost read, the language of architecture and abandonment, of construction quality and maintenance failure, of a civilization that left its physical logic intact even as its human meaning dissolved. But sometimes the silence takes a more precise and more frustrating form. Sometimes a civilization leaves behind not the mute evidence of structures and pottery, but actual writing, deliberate, systematic, clearly intentional communication. And we still cannot understand a word of it. This is one of those cases. The city of Byblos sits on the Lebanese coast, on a promontory above the eastern Mediterranean, in a position that seems almost too perfect. A natural harbor, fertile hinterland, cedar forests on the mountain slopes behind it, and a sea lane that connects in one direction to Egypt and North Africa, and in the other to the Aegean, Cyprus, and the broader Mediterranean world. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, with occupation stretching back to the Neolithic period and a documented urban history that reaches at least to the early 3rd millennium BC. Byblos was, for much of the Bronze Age, the primary conduit through which Egyptian commercial and cultural influence reached the Levant. Egyptian objects appear in Byblos in quantity and quality that speak to a relationship of unusual depth and duration. Byblos exported cedar wood to Egypt, timber essential for shipbuilding and monumental construction in a country with almost none of its own, and in return received prestige goods, administrative contact, and the kind of cultural exchange that leaves permanent marks on a society's visual and intellectual vocabulary. It was in this context of deep Egyptian contact that a local script emerged in Byblos sometime in the early 2nd millennium BC. A writing system that borrowed the visual vocabulary of Egyptian hieroglyphs sufficiently to earn the descriptor Pseudo-Hieroglyphic from the scholars who first studied it, while being, in its underlying structure and the language it encodes, something entirely its own. Picture the objects on which this script appears. They are not papyrus documents or clay tablets. They are mostly spatulas and tablets of bronze and stone, inscribed with signs that have a certain visual elegance, rounded, carefully formed, suggesting a scribal tradition with established conventions and aesthetic standards. The signs number somewhere between 80 and 100 distinct forms, a range that places the script in an intermediate category between the large sign inventories of logographic systems like Egyptian hieroglyphs and the small inventories of purely alphabetic systems. This range is consistent with a syllabic script, one in which each sign represents a consonant-vowel combination, though the precise structural analysis remains contested. 10 inscriptions are known, possibly a few more depending on how fragmentary fragments are classified. The total corpus of text available for analysis is, by any measure, extraordinarily small. This is the first and most fundamental problem confronting anyone who attempts to decipher the Byblos pseudo-hieroglyphic script. Decipherment of an unknown writing system requires, at minimum, sufficient text to allow statistical analysis of sign frequencies, combinatorial patterns, and structural regularities. The Linear B script of Mycenaean Greece was deciphered in part because a large enough corpus existed to make those patterns visible. The Byblos corpus, by contrast, is so small that statistical approaches reach their limits almost immediately, producing results whose significance is difficult to evaluate. The second problem is the absence of a bilingual text. The Rosetta Stone unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs because it presented the same content in 3 scripts, one of which was already understood. No equivalent exists for the Byblos script. There is no inscription that presents the same text in pseudo-hieroglyphic and in a known language, no diplomatic document that a known ruler sent in 2 scripts, no dedicatory formula whose content can be inferred from parallel examples elsewhere. Scholars have not been idle in the face of these obstacles. The most sustained attempt at decipherment was made by the French scholar Edouard Dorme in the mid-20th century, who proposed a partial reading of the texts based on the assumption that the underlying language was a Semitic one, consistent with the linguistic environment of the Levantine coast during the period in question. Dorme's work produced readings that some subsequent scholars have found partially persuasive and others have found largely unconvincing. The debate has not resolved. More recent attempts have applied computational methods to the corpus, using algorithmic analysis to identify structural patterns that might not be visible to manual inspection, comparing sign distribution and combinatorial behavior against the known profiles of candidate scripts and languages. These approaches have generated interesting hypotheses. They have not generated consensus. The question of what language the script encodes is, in some ways, prior to the question of how to read it. If the underlying language is a known Semitic tongue, Phoenician, or a predecessor of Phoenician, or a related dialect, then the decipherment problem, while still formidable, operates within a constrained space of possibilities. If the language is something less familiar, or something with unusual structural features not well represented in the known linguistic record of the region, the challenge is considerably greater. Some researchers have raised the possibility that the Byblos pseudo-hieroglyphic script encodes not the everyday administrative or commercial language of the city, but a specialized register, a priestly, ceremonial, or diplomatic language that may have differed significantly from the vernacular. Sacred or prestige languages in the ancient world were sometimes deliberately archaic, deliberately obscure, maintained as markers of specialized knowledge by groups with reasons to keep their content inaccessible to outsiders. If the Byblos texts are records of ritual practice or religious formulation, their language might be a deliberate construction rather than a naturally evolved vernacular, which would make comparison with known linguistic relatives considerably less reliable. There are also questions about the script's origins that current understanding does not resolve. The visual borrowing from Egyptian hieroglyphs is clear, but the underlying structural logic appears to be locally developed rather than derived from Egyptian practice. Who created this system? Under what circumstances was it developed? Was it the invention of a single scribal innovator, working within a tradition of Egyptian visual culture, or the gradual evolution of a community's attempt to adapt a foreign prestige script to local linguistic needs? The 10 inscriptions sit in museum collections and in scholarly literature, studied and restudied, submitted to new analytical approaches as methodologies develop, and still fundamentally unread. They represent the most intimate form of human communication, deliberate language, carefully inscribed, intended to convey specific meaning to a specific audience. And that meaning remains nearly 4,000 years after the last scribe set down his tool, completely beyond our reach. What were the people of Bronze Age Byblos trying to say? What knowledge, what obligation, what record of the world as they understood it did they preserve in those elegant, indecipherable signs? The script is there, the meaning is not, and the distance between those two facts is one of the most quietly haunting gaps in the entire human record. The distance between a sign and its meaning. That is what the Byblos pseudo-hieroglyphic texts force us to confront. The unsettling possibility that human communication, carefully preserved across 4 millennia, can remain permanently sealed against understanding. But the Byblos script, for all its frustration, at least gives us something to look at, something to analyze, to submit to new methods, to return to with fresh perspectives as scholarly tools develop. What happens when there is nothing to look at all? Not because a civilization failed to write, not because its records were never created, but because everything it produced, every tablet, every archive, every administrative document and royal inscription and temple record has simply vanished, leaving behind only the outline of an absence so complete that it requires a moment to fully appreciate. This is the situation with Mannae. The kingdom of Mannae occupied a region of considerable strategic and geographical significance in what is now the northwestern corner of Iran, in the area south and southwest of Lake Urmia, a landscape of fertile valleys, defensible uplands and river systems that connect the Armenian highlands to the north with the Zagros mountain ranges to the south and east. It was not a marginal location. It sat at the intersection of routes connecting Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the South Caucasus, and the Iranian Plateau, a position that, in the ancient world, tended to produce either wealthy and sophisticated states or devastated ones, depending on how the surrounding powers were behaving at any given moment. Mannae was both, at different times. The kingdom appears in the historical record during the 9th century BC, mentioned in Assyrian campaign texts with the matter-of-fact familiarity that suggests it was already an established entity when Assyrian scribes first noted it. Over the following 2 centuries, Mannae navigated, sometimes successfully, sometimes catastrophically, the competing pressures of Assyrian expansion from the west and southwest, Urartian expansion from the north, and the persistent threat of Scythian and Cimmerian incursions from the steppe world beyond the Caucasus. It was a kingdom that survived by a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliance, and the kind of geopolitical flexibility that only genuinely sophisticated political cultures can sustain over extended periods. That sophistication is not in doubt. The Assyrian and Urartian sources that mention Mannae describe a kingdom with a recognizable state structure: a king, a court, provincial governors, military forces organized along lines that the Assyrians found sufficiently formidable to treat as a serious adversary rather than a simple tributary. There are references to Mannaean cities, to Mannaean temples, to a Mannaean political culture that had its own internal coherence and its own historical memory. And there are, scattered across the region associated with Mannae, archaeological sites that confirm the presence of a sophisticated material culture during the relevant period. Distinctive metalwork, weapons, vessels, ornamental objects in bronze and gold, has been recovered from sites in the Lake Urmia basin that scholars associate with the Mannaean cultural sphere. This metalwork reflects a tradition of considerable technical and artistic achievement, with stylistic elements that are neither purely Assyrian nor purely Urartian, but something distinctly regional. These objects confirm that the people the Assyrian texts describe were real, organized, and capable of producing material culture of genuine quality. But the archives are gone. Every ancient state of Mannae's scale and duration generated written records. The administrative demands of governing a multi-provincial kingdom with military forces, tribute obligations, temple institutions, and diplomatic relationships with multiple great powers could not have been managed without systematic written documentation. The Assyrians, who interacted extensively with Mannae, were themselves among the most prolific record keepers of the ancient world. And yet the Mannaean side of those interactions, the correspondence and treaty texts and administrative records that Mannae must have produced, has not survived in any identified form. No archive has been excavated, no tablet cache has been discovered in the territory associated with the kingdom. The written voice of Mannae, its own account of its history, its own administrative language, its own royal inscriptions, is entirely absent from the current archaeological record. The practical explanations for this absence begin with the state of archaeological investigation in the region. Northwestern Iran has been surveyed and excavated in a limited and discontinuous way, with significant gaps in coverage that reflect the political and logistical challenges of working in this area over the past century. The site or sites that served as Mannaean administrative centers, where archives would most likely have been held, have not been conclusively identified, which means that the most promising locations for recovering written records have not been systematically investigated. There is also the question of writing material. If Mannae used perishable materials, leather, wood, papyrus, for its administrative records rather than the clay tablets that have survived so well in Mesopotamian contexts, then the physical disappearance of the archive would require no special explanation. Organic materials simply do not survive 3 millennia of burial in most soil conditions. An entire administrative tradition could be lost without trace, not through catastrophe, but through the ordinary chemistry of decomposition. But some researchers have noted that the metalwork associated with Mannae, the bronze and gold objects recovered from regional sites, does not include inscribed pieces of the kind that appear in neighboring cultures at comparable levels of sophistication. Urartian metalwork frequently carries inscriptions. Assyrian objects of prestige are often inscribed. The apparent absence of inscribed objects in the Mannaean material culture is a pattern that may reflect the use of a different writing medium, or may reflect a scribal tradition that kept writing confined to specific administrative contexts rather than extending it to prestige objects. Or it may mean something more provocative. Some scholars have raised the possibility that Mannae used a writing system that has not yet been identified as Mannaean, that Mannaean administrative texts exist somewhere in the epigraphic record, misattributed to another culture, or written in a borrowed script whose use by Mannaean scribes has not been recognized. The candidates most frequently proposed are adaptations of Assyrian cuneiform, which Mannaean scribes could plausibly have adopted given the kingdom's extensive contact with Assyria. If Mannaean administrative documents were written in cuneiform, they might be physically indistinguishable from other cuneiform texts without contextual information about their provenance. This is a hypothesis, not a finding, but it points toward a genuinely unsettling possibility that the Mannaean archive is not absent from the record, but present in it, unrecognized, waiting for someone to identify the right tablets in the right collection and understand what they actually are. A kingdom sophisticated enough to negotiate with Assyria and Urartu simultaneously, to survive for 2 centuries at the intersection of competing imperial ambitions, to produce metalwork of genuine artistic distinction. That kingdom had scribes. It had records. It had a written account of its own existence. Where is that account? And if it exists somewhere, in an unexcavated site, in a misattributed tablet, in a collection that has not yet been fully studied, what would it tell us about a kingdom that we currently know almost entirely through the eyes of its rivals? A kingdom that spoke, but whose words we cannot find. That is the particular silence Mannae leaves behind. Not the silence of a people who did not write, but of a people whose writing has been swallowed by time, by soil chemistry, by the accident of which sites have and have not been excavated. And as we turn southward now, back toward the Arabian Peninsula, we encounter a variation on that same theme. Not a missing archive exactly, but a missing foundation. A city whose later life is relatively well documented, whose earlier life has almost completely vanished, and whose vanishing raises questions that the existing evidence cannot comfortably answer. The city of Thaj. It sits in the Al-Asa region of what is now eastern Saudi Arabia, not far from the Gulf Coast, in a landscape of low, flat terrain broken by sabkha, salt flats, and the occasional elevation that in this part of the world qualifies as a hill. It is not, on first encounter, a landscape that announces the presence of something historically significant. The horizon is wide and featureless. The light is harsh. The vegetation sparse. There is nothing in the immediate visual environment that prepares you for what the ground contains. Thaj is one of the largest ancient walled cities yet identified on the Arabian Peninsula. Its enclosure wall, roughly rectangular in form, encompasses an area of approximately 500 hectares, a scale that places it among the significant urban centers of the ancient Near East, comparable in size to contemporaneous cities in Mesopotamia and the Levant. Within and around that wall, surveys and excavations have revealed evidence of a city that flourished primarily during the Hellenistic and early Parthian periods, roughly the 4th century BC through the 2nd or 3rd century AD. There are temples, residential quarters, cemeteries, and material culture that reflects commercial connections spanning the Gulf trading world and beyond. Gold jewelry of exceptional craftsmanship has been recovered from Thaj's cemeteries, objects whose technical sophistication implies a wealthy, well-connected community with access to skilled artisans and precious materials. This is the Thaj that archaeology has partially documented. This is the city that appears, however incompletely, in the scholarly literature. But beneath this city, preceding it, perhaps generating the conditions that made it possible, there is an earlier settlement whose character and extent remain deeply unclear. The stratigraphic evidence from excavated areas of the site indicates that occupation at Thaj did not begin with the Hellenistic period. There are earlier layers. There is material that predates the well-documented urban phase, pointing toward activity at this location during the Iron Age, and possibly earlier. What that earlier activity represents, a small village, a trading post, a more substantial community, is a question that the limited excavation work conducted so far has not been able to answer. Why does this matter? Because the geography of Thaj makes it almost inconceivable that the location sat unoccupied or lightly used through the centuries preceding its Hellenistic florescence. Eastern Arabia during the Iron Age was not an empty landscape. It was a zone of active commercial and cultural exchange, connected to the Gulf trading networks that we have traced throughout this exploration, adjacent to the Oasis agricultural systems of Al-Assa that were capable of supporting substantial populations, and positioned along routes that carried goods between southern Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the wider Gulf world. A location of this geographical significance, with its scale, its eventual urban development, its access to both agricultural land and trade routes, typically does not emerge suddenly into urban complexity. It builds toward it, through phases of occupation that establish the social relationships, the economic foundations, and the physical infrastructure that later urban development requires. The predecessors of great ancient cities are usually there, in the ground, waiting to be found. At Thaj, they are not yet found. Or rather, they have been glimpsed, sensed in the stratigraphy, implied by isolated finds, suggested by the logic of the location, but not recovered in any form that allows their character to be described with confidence. The practical reasons for this gap are familiar by now. Excavation at Thaj has been limited relative to the site's scale. The areas investigated represent a fraction of the total enclosed area, and the deepest stratigraphic investigations have not always been conducted in the locations most likely to preserve early occupation evidence. The site has also suffered from surface disturbance, the kind of damage that accumulates over centuries of agricultural use, construction activity, and in more recent times, the attentions of looters whose depredations have compromised the stratigraphic integrity of parts of the site. But the absence of well-documented early occupation at a site of this scale and location has led some researchers to ask whether the founding of Thaj's earlier settlement might have involved a population movement, a community relocating from somewhere else to this particular location for reasons that the current evidence does not explain. If an earlier community established itself at Thaj during the Iron Age as a deliberate act of foundation rather than a gradual organic growth, the circumstances of that foundation might be recoverable in the archaeological record if the right areas are investigated. From where might such a founding population have come? Some researchers have noted that the Al-Assa region shows evidence of settlement activity during the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age at multiple locations, not all of which can be straightforwardly connected to the known sequence at Thaj. The possibility that Thaj represents a consolidation, a drawing together of population from smaller, more dispersed settlements into a single larger location, has been raised as a framework for understanding the site's early development. Such consolidation events are documented elsewhere in the ancient world, typically in contexts of either opportunity or pressure, and sometimes both simultaneously. There are also questions raised by the cemeteries. The funerary record at Thaj includes burial types and ritual practices that appear, in their earliest phases, to have roots in traditions somewhat different from those dominant in the later Hellenistic city. These earlier burial practices hint at a community with a cultural background that may not map cleanly onto the better-known populations of the region, suggesting perhaps a founding group with connections to areas or traditions that current scholarship has not fully traced. The gold jewelry recovered from the site's cemeteries deserves its own moment of attention here. Objects of this quality and this technical sophistication do not appear in archaeological contexts without a history behind them. A history of accumulated wealth, of established craft traditions, of commercial relationships that made access to precious materials possible over extended periods. That history, for Thaj, extends back into a phase of occupation that we cannot yet fully read. A city of 500 hectares, wealthy enough to bury its dead in gold, connected to the trading networks of the ancient Gulf world, and its origins remain in the ground, unexcavated, patient as the sabkha that surrounds it. What was Thaj before it became the city we can partially describe? And in the unexcavated depths of that great enclosure, what evidence of that earlier community waits? undisturbed, for the season when archaeology finally reaches it. The gold buried at Thaj speaks of accumulated wealth, of connections and traditions whose origins remain just beyond the reach of current investigation. That wealth moved through networks, was stored in institutions, was administered by organizational structures sophisticated enough to manage the flow of precious materials across considerable distances. And when we think about institutions in the ancient world, the great organizing centers that accumulated wealth, managed redistribution, preserved knowledge, and sustained the administrative continuity of civilizations across centuries. One structure stands above almost all others in the depth and duration of its documented history. A temple. Not a monument. Not a palace. A working institution, continuously active for longer than most civilizations have existed, whose records once constituted one of the most detailed administrative archives the ancient world ever produced, and whose final centuries are, in ways that continue to trouble scholars, almost completely silent. The Eanna temple complex at Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, is one of the oldest continuously functioning religious institutions in recorded human history. Uruk itself is among the earliest cities on Earth, a place of urban organization and monumental architecture whose origins reach back to the 5th millennium BC, whose influence on the development of writing, administration, and urbanism across the ancient Near East was foundational in the most literal sense of the word. The city gave its name to an entire archaeological period, and at its center, for most of its long history, stood Eanna, the House of Heaven, the temple precinct dedicated primarily to Eanna, goddess of love, war, and the full complicated spectrum of human experience that those two domains encompass. Picture Eanna at its height, not as a single building but as a complex, a walled precinct containing multiple temples, storage facilities, administrative buildings, workshops, and the residences of the personnel who served the institution. At its peak during the Uruk period and again during the Neo-Babylonian era, this complex was both a religious center and an economic engine of the First Order. Eanna owned land. It operated agricultural estates. It ran textile workshops employing hundreds of people. It lent silver at interest, managed herds of livestock, collected tribute, and disbursed rations to a workforce whose scale would not look out of place in a modern medium-sized enterprise. And it kept records of all of it. The cuneiform archive recovered from Uruk over more than a century of excavation by German archaeological missions that began work at the site in the late 19th century and continued, with interruptions through the 20th, is among the most important bodies of ancient documentation ever recovered. Hundreds of thousands of tablets, spanning multiple millennia, recording the administrative life of the city and its temple institutions in extraordinary detail. Contracts, receipts, astronomical observations, ritual texts, literary compositions, letters, legal proceedings, the full range of what a sophisticated ancient civilization committed to clay. The archive is not complete. No ancient archive is. But for certain periods, notably the Neo-Babylonian period of the 6th and 7th centuries BC and the subsequent Achaemenid Persian period, the Uruk documentation is rich enough to support detailed historical reconstruction. Scholars can follow individual families across generations, trace property transactions across decades, reconstruct the organizational structure of the temple's economic operations with considerable precision. It is history at a resolution that most ancient periods cannot approach. And then, toward the end of the Achaemenid period and into the Seleucid era, the period following Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, roughly the late 4th and 3rd centuries BC, something changes in the documentary record. It does not stop abruptly. The transition is gradual, uneven, and in some ways more troubling for its gradualness than a clean break would be. The volume of administrative documentation declines. The range of institutional activities represented in the surviving records narrows. The texture of the archive, that dense, overlapping, cross-referencing quality that characterizes the richest periods of Uruk documentation, becomes thinner, more fragmentary. less capable of sustaining the kind of detailed reconstruction that earlier periods allow. And by the late Seleucid period, the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, Eanna, one of the oldest functioning religious institutions in human history, falls effectively silent in the documentary record. The temple that had been producing administrative texts for millennia generates in its final phase almost nothing that has been recovered. The standard explanation for this documentary decline begins with political disruption. The transition from Achaemenid to Seleucid rule involved significant reorganization of the institutional landscape of Babylonia. The Seleucid kings, heirs to Alexander's conquests, brought Greek administrative traditions into contact with deeply rooted Babylonian institutional practices, and the resulting adjustments affected temples like Eanna in ways that are still being worked out by scholars. Land tenure arrangements changed. The relationship between temple institutions and royal authority was renegotiated. The economic foundations that had sustained Eanna's administrative apparatus may have been altered in ways that reduced both the scale and the documentary intensity of its operations. There is also the question of writing medium. The shift from cuneiform on clay tablets toward Aramaic on perishable materials, papyrus, leather, wooden boards, was already underway across the Near East during the Achaemenid period and accelerated in the Hellenistic era. If Eanna's administrators began conducting a portion of their record-keeping in Aramaic on perishable materials, that portion of the archive would simply not have survived. Clay tablets endure. Papyrus does not in the soil conditions of southern Iraq. This explanation has genuine merit and is widely accepted as a partial account of the documentary gap. But partial is the operative word, because the decline of Eanna's documentary record is not simply a quantitative reduction, less of the same thing. It appears to involve a qualitative change in what is being recorded and how. The astronomical texts, which represent one of Uruk's most significant intellectual contributions to the ancient world, continue into the Seleucid period with considerable vigor. The mathematical and astronomical traditions associated with Uruk's scholarly community maintained their vitality even as the administrative archive thinned. Something was still happening at Eanna, intellectually and presumably institutionally, during the period when administrative documentation becomes sparse. What was it? What was the temple doing in its final centuries that the surviving record does not adequately capture? Some researchers have proposed that the later Eanna was a significantly different kind of institution from its earlier incarnation, less an economic powerhouse managing large-scale agricultural and craft production, more a specialized center of scholarly and ritual activity serving a reduced but still dedicated community. If the temple's economic functions had been substantially transferred to other institutions or to private enterprise during the Seleucid reorganization, the administrative archive would naturally reflect that reduction without implying that the temple itself had become marginal. Others have focused on the physical circumstances of the site. Uruk during the Seleucid period was also home to a new Greek city, Orkoi in Greek sources, whose relationship to the older Babylonian urban fabric is not entirely clear. The coexistence of Greek and Babylonian institutional cultures at the same site creates interpretive complications, because material that might be Eanna-related could be difficult to distinguish from material associated with the newer Greek administrative structures without precise stratigraphic context. And there are the tablets that have not been excavated. The site of Uruk is enormous, and despite more than a century of archaeological work, significant portions of it remain uninvestigated. The possibility that archive deposits from Eanna's later periods exist in unexcavated areas of the site is not merely theoretical. It is a reasonable expectation, given the scale of what has already been recovered and the known tendency of ancient institutions to maintain records in multiple locations across their physical complexes. There is also a more troubling possibility that some scholars have raised with appropriate caution. The late Seleucid period in Babylonia was not politically stable. Seleucid control of the region was contested, fragmented, and eventually displaced by the Parthian expansion from the east. In periods of political instability, institutional archives face risks that go beyond the ordinary entropy of organic material decay. Records can be deliberately destroyed. by external forces seeking to eliminate evidence of prior property arrangements, or by internal actors managing transitions in ways that required eliminating inconvenient documentation. If Eanna's final administrative records were destroyed rather than simply lost, the question of who destroyed them and why opens onto a set of historical dynamics that the surviving evidence is not equipped to answer. What we are left with is a 3,000-year institution that produced some of the richest administrative documentation in the ancient world, and whose final chapter reads, in the surviving record, as little more than a whisper before silence. The astronomical tablets continue. The rituals presumably continued. And then, sometime in the 1st century BC, the physical evidence for institutional activity at Eanna effectively ends. An institution that outlasted empires, that survived conquests and political transformations and economic reorganizations across 30 centuries, closed, or transformed beyond recognition, in a period so poorly documented that we cannot even say with confidence what the end looked like. What was Eanna in its final years? What did the last priests and scholars of that ancient precinct know, practice, and record? And where did that knowledge go when the House of Heaven finally fell silent? The House of Heaven fell silent, and the knowledge it held dispersed into the same darkness that has claimed so much of what the ancient world understood about itself. We have followed that pattern of loss across continents and millennia. Archives destroyed or decayed, sanctuaries absorbed into landscape, cities whose foundations remain sealed beneath their own later histories. But sometimes the mystery takes a form that is not about absence at all. Sometimes it is about presence. Unmistakable, undeniable, physically overwhelming presence, and the complete inability to explain what that presence means. This is one of those cases. Fly over the Harrat Khaybar in northwestern Saudi Arabia, and what you see beneath you will take a moment to process. The landscape itself is already extraordinary. A volcanic field of ancient lava flows, black and fractured, spreading across hundreds of kilometers in formations that look, from altitude, like the surface of another planet. Cinder cones rise at intervals. Lava tubes scar the surface in long, sinuous lines. The geology here is geologically recent by the standards of deep time. Some of these flows are only a few thousand years old, and the region experienced volcanic activity as recently as the 19th century AD. It is a landscape in active, if slow, geological conversation with itself. And across that landscape, distributed with a density and regularity that becomes more striking the more carefully you look, are structures. Stone structures, built by human hands, in numbers and configurations that have startled researchers since satellite imagery first made them visible in systematic detail. Thousands of them. The structures of Harrat Khaybar, and the broader category of what researchers have termed works of the old men, a translation of the local Arabic term works of the ancient ones, come in a range of forms whose variety has complicated efforts to assign them a single function or a single period of construction. There are wheels, circular or roughly circular stone arrangements with internal divisions radiating from a central hub, ranging in diameter from a few meters to several hundred. There are kites, angular enclosures with long stone walls extending outward like the tails of the object they are named for, interpreted by many researchers as ancient animal traps designed to funnel gazelle or other game toward a killing ground. There are pendants, parallel lines of stone cairns arranged in sequences that can extend for considerable distances across the terrain. And there are more irregular forms, walls, enclosures, cleared areas, and configurations that resist easy categorization. The kite structures, distributed across a wide area of the Arabian and Levantine landscape, have the most robust functional interpretation. Ethnographic parallels, historical descriptions of communal hunting, and the clear spatial logic of the funnel and enclosure design make a reasonable case for their interpretation as hunting infrastructure. This does not resolve all questions about them. Their age is difficult to determine, the scale of social organization required to build and use them was substantial, and their distribution across the landscape implies a degree of territorial management that says something interesting about the communities who created them. But their basic function is at least plausible. The wheels are considerably more difficult. They appear across a geographic range extending from the Arabian Peninsula through the Levant and into parts of Syria and Jordan, making them one of the most widely distributed categories of ancient stone structure in the region. Their construction required effort, moving and placing stones across terrain that is not always easy to traverse, creating forms that are often geometrically precise in ways that imply planning rather than improvisation. Many of them are not visible in their full form from ground level. You can stand inside a wheel structure and not recognize it as such. The form is only fully apparent from above. This last observation has generated considerable discussion, and not all of it has been entirely restrained. The fact that structures were built in forms only properly visible from altitude has prompted questions that range from the practical to the frankly speculative. Practical interpretation suggests that the aerial perspective was not the intended viewpoint, that the structures were designed to be experienced from within, or to mark territory visibly from adjacent elevated terrain, or to serve a function whose logic does not depend on aerial visibility at all. The apparent aerial form may be, from this perspective, an artifact of how we have come to know these structures, rather than a clue to why they were built. More speculative interpretations have attracted public attention disproportionate to their scholarly standing. The aerial visibility of the wheels, combined with their location in a volcanic landscape that already looks otherworldly, has made them a recurring feature in discussions of anomalous ancient structures that resist mainstream explanation. These discussions are not taken seriously in the archaeological literature, and there is no credible evidence to support them. But they speak to something real. The genuine strangeness of structures whose purpose, after serious scholarly investigation, remains undetermined. What does the serious scholarly literature actually say? The dating of the Harrat Khaybar structures is imprecise, and this imprecision is itself informative. Different structures within the broader category appear to date to different periods, some to the Neolithic, some to the Bronze Age, some possibly later. The region was occupied across a very long span of human prehistory and history, and the stone structures visible today may represent the accumulated work of many different communities across many different centuries, each adding to or modifying a landscape that already contained the work of predecessors. This diachronic complexity makes functional interpretation more difficult. A landscape of structures built across thousands of years by communities with different economic practices, different social organizations, and different relationships to the terrain cannot be explained by a single unified theory. The wheel structures, the kites, the pendants may not all mean the same thing, may not all serve the same purpose, may not even belong to the same cultural tradition despite their physical proximity in the landscape. Some researchers working specifically on the wheel structures have proposed funerary or commemorative functions. The wheels as markers of burial locations, or as spaces for mortuary ritual whose specific forms are not well documented in other sources. This interpretation is supported in some cases by the presence of cairns or stone piles at the centers, or along the spokes of wheel structures that could represent burial deposits. But systematic investigation of the association between wheel structures and burial evidence has not been conducted at sufficient scale to establish this connection firmly. Others have proposed territorial marking, the wheels as boundary indicators, as statements of presence and ownership in a landscape, where the boundaries between different groups' ranges were important but difficult to maintain through physical barriers alone. In a pastoral economy dependent on access to seasonal grazing, marking territorial claims visibly across a landscape that different groups traversed repeatedly would have had practical value. A third interpretive tradition emphasizes ritual and cosmological function, the wheels as spaces for ceremony, for gathering, for the kind of collective activity that constitutes community identity in societies without the fixed institutional structures of urban civilization. The geometry of a wheel in many cultural traditions carries symbolic weight. The circle as a representation of completeness, of cyclical time, of the bounded space within which sacred activity occurs. If the wheel structures of Harrat Khaybar served as gathering places for ritual activity, their form would carry meaning that was legible to the communities who built them, even if that meaning is no longer recoverable from the physical evidence alone. None of these interpretations is mutually exclusive. A structure built as a territorial marker might subsequently become a ritual gathering space. A funerary monument might be incorporated into later ceremonial practice that extended its significance beyond its original purpose. The wheel structures may have meant different things to different communities at different times, accumulating layers of significance as the landscape they inhabited accumulated layers of occupation. What makes Harrat Khaybar specifically compelling within this broader picture is the combination of density and setting. The concentration of structures within a volcanic landscape that was itself not obviously hospitable to permanent settlement raises questions about why this particular terrain attracted so much constructive attention. The volcanic geology would have made agriculture difficult and water scarce. The lava flows that define the Harrat's surface are not easy to traverse. Communities that invested significant labor in building stone structures here were doing so for reasons that go beyond simple economic logic. Was there something about this landscape? Its visual drama, its geological strangeness, its relationship to fire and transformation. That made it a place of special significance in the cosmological frameworks of the people who built here. We suggested earlier in this exploration that the Midianite sacred sanctuary might be located in exactly this volcanic terrain. If that speculation has any merit, the stone structures of Harrat Khaybar might represent not just territorial marking or funerary practice, but the accumulated physical evidence of a sacred landscape, a place that communities returned to across millennia, not because it was economically productive, but because it was, in some framework of meaning, that we cannot now reconstruct, important. Thousands of structures built across thousands of years in a landscape that looks like the surface of another world. Some of them visible only from above, some of them still unexamined at ground level, most of them undated. Who built them across all those centuries? What did they believe they were doing when they moved those stones into those precise configurations? And in the portions of the Harrat Khaybar that satellite imagery has revealed but no researcher has yet walked, what other forms are waiting to be seen? And perhaps, finally, understood. Thousands of structures, moved into precise configurations by hands whose intentions we cannot read, in a landscape whose significance we can sense but not articulate. The stone structures of Harrat Khaybar remind us that the ancient world communicated in registers that we have not yet learned to decode. That meaning was inscribed not just in clay tablets and bronze inscriptions, but in the arrangement of rocks across volcanic plains, in the geometry of circles visible only from above, in the accumulated physical testimony of communities whose inner lives remain opaque to us. But sometimes the communication was direct. Sometimes civilizations express themselves in ways that should be entirely legible, in monumental architecture, in carved inscriptions, in the formal visual language of royal power that the ancient Near East developed to a high degree of sophistication. And even then, even with all the apparatus of deliberate self-expression in place, the record can go silent in ways that leave scholars confronting a gap they cannot fully explain. This is the situation with Bit Bahiani. The Upper Kabur Basin in what is now northeastern Syria is a landscape of wide, flat agricultural plains bisected by river systems that drain southward toward the Euphrates. It is not a dramatic landscape. There are no mountains, no volcanic fields, no geological features that announce the presence of something significant. What it has and has had for 10,000 years is water and soil, the two things that, in the ancient Near East, reliably generated civilization. The Kabur River and its tributaries created an agricultural zone of considerable productivity, and that productivity, across the long arc of Near Eastern history, attracted settlement, organization, and eventually the attention of empires. In the early 1st millennium BC, this basin was home to a kingdom that the historical sources, primarily Assyrian, as so often in this region and period, identify as Bit Bahiani. The term itself follows the standard Aramaic naming convention of the period. Bit, meaning house or dynasty, followed by the name of an ancestral founder. Bit Bahiani was, in this sense, the kingdom of the house of Bahiani, a polity organized around a ruling dynasty of Aramean origin that had established itself in the Kabur Basin during the period of political reorganization that followed the Bronze Age collapse. Its capital was Guzana, and Guzana has been found. The site of Tel Halaf, excavated first by the German archaeologist Max von Oppenheim in the early 20th century, and subsequently by later missions working to recover what they could from the damage inflicted by the Second World War and its aftermath, corresponds to the ancient city of Guzana with reasonable scholarly confidence. The excavations at Tel Halaf revealed a palace complex of considerable ambition. The Hilani palace of a ruler named Kapara, decorated with sculptural programs that combined Aramean, Assyrian, and local artistic traditions in ways that speak to a court culture of genuine sophistication. Carved orthostats, stone slabs lining the lower portions of walls, depicted mythological scenes, royal figures, and hybrid creatures in a visual language that drew from multiple traditions while maintaining a distinctive local character. These sculptures, where they have survived, are extraordinary. They represent the artistic ambitions of a kingdom that understood the political language of monumental art, that knew, as all ancient Near Eastern polities knew, that the visual environment of a palace communicated the nature and legitimacy of power to everyone who entered it. And yet the archive is missing. A palace of this scale and ambition, the residence of a ruling dynasty that maintained diplomatic relationships with Assyria, that collected tribute, that administered an agricultural zone of significant productivity, generated records. It must have. The administrative demands of running a kingdom, even a relatively small one, in the ancient Near East required systematic documentation. Tribute lists, land records, correspondence with neighboring polities and with the Assyrian court, temple administrative texts, legal documents recording property transactions and dispute resolutions, the full range of documentation that Assyrian sites of comparable period and scale have produced in abundance. At Tel Halaf, this documentation has not been found. The practical explanation begins with the excavation history of the site. Von Oppenheim's early 20th century excavations, conducted under the standards of their time, prioritized the recovery of monumental art and architectural remains over the systematic documentation and recovery of smaller finds that might include tablet archives. Clay tablets, particularly when fragmentary or unimpressive in appearance, could easily have been missed, misidentified, or inadequately recorded under the excavation conditions of that era. The subsequent damage to the site, and to the collected materials, a significant portion of which were destroyed in Berlin during the Second World War, further compromised the evidentiary record. Later excavations at the site have been more methodologically rigorous, but the areas investigated have not yet yielded the archive deposits that the site's known importance suggests should exist somewhere within it. There is also the question of what happened to Guzana during and after its incorporation into the Assyrian provincial system. The kingdom of Bitbahiani did not maintain its independence indefinitely. By the late 9th century BC, Guzana had been absorbed into the Assyrian administrative system as a provincial center, its local dynasty replaced or subordinated to Assyrian-appointed governors. This transition would have involved significant reorganization of the city's administrative apparatus, and in such transitions, records from the previous administration sometimes did not survive. Not necessarily through deliberate destruction, but through the ordinary disruptions of institutional change, the reuse of storage spaces, the recycling of clay from old tablets into new construction material. Some researchers have noted that the Assyrian provincial administration at Guzana, the successor system that replaced the Bitbahiani kingdom, is itself relatively poorly documented compared to other Assyrian provincial centers. This double absence is striking. Not only do we lack records from the independent kingdom period, we also lack the kind of Assyrian provincial archive that sites like Nimrud and Nineveh have produced in abundance. Guzana, despite its documented importance as a provincial capital, is curiously quiet in the documentary record of the Assyrian imperial system as well. This suggests that the archival gap at Tel Halaf may not be entirely a product of excavation incompleteness. It may reflect something about how records were stored and managed at this particular site. Perhaps a greater reliance on perishable writing materials, perhaps a different administrative culture that generated less clay tablet documentation than the Mesopotamian heartland norm, perhaps specific events in the site's history that compromised archive survival in ways that have not been identified. The Aramean cultural background of Bitbahiani is relevant here. The Arameans, as a broader cultural and linguistic group, were associated with the spread of Aramaic as an administrative language and with the use of papyrus and other perishable writing materials alongside or instead of clay tablets. If the scribal culture of Bitbayani operated primarily in Aramaic on perishable materials, the absence of a tablet archive becomes less surprising and also, unfortunately, less recoverable. The documents may have existed in abundance and simply have not survived the chemistry of 2.5 millennia of burial. But there is a more specific question that the sculptural evidence at Tel Halaf raises, and that the missing archive prevents us from answering. The Khapara Palace sculptures represent a distinct artistic tradition, one that has been extensively analyzed for its stylistic sources and parallels, but whose specific iconographic program, whose narrative or symbolic content, cannot be fully interpreted without the kind of textual context that an archive would provide. What stories were those carved figures telling? What mythological or historical program did Khapara's court intend visitors to read in the sequence of images that lined his palace walls? In Assyrian palaces, where archives and sculptural programs have both survived, scholars can cross-reference visual and textual evidence to reconstruct the ideological framework within which the art was produced and received. At Tel Halaf, the sculptures stand without their explanatory context, visually compelling, stylistically distinctive, and semantically incomplete. Some of the hybrid creatures depicted in the Tel Halaf sculptures have parallels in Mesopotamian mythological traditions, suggesting at minimum a shared iconographic vocabulary. But the specific local tradition of Bitbahiani, its pantheon, its royal mythology, its understanding of the relationship between human and divine authority, remains reconstructible only in outline, from parallels and inferences rather than from direct documentation. A kingdom that built a palace decorated with sophisticated sculptural programs, that maintained diplomatic relationships with the most powerful empire of its day, that administered a productive agricultural zone for generations. That kingdom had a full intellectual and cultural life that the surviving evidence can only gesture toward. Somewhere, perhaps in the unexcavated portions of Tel Halaf, perhaps in storage contexts that von Oppenheim's team passed over, perhaps in locations within the Kabur Basin that have not yet been investigated, the records of Bitbahiani may still exist in some form. What would those records tell us about the kingdom behind the sculptures? What would Khapara's own scribes say about the world they inhabited, the decisions they made, the beliefs they held? If we could only find the clay, or the papyrus, or whatever medium they chose to preserve their voice. The palace walls have spoken in the only language that survived. The archive, if it exists, has not yet found its way back into the light. The palace walls of Bitbahiani speak in a language of carved stone whose full meaning remains just beyond our grasp. Images without their explanatory texts, a visual program whose ideological framework we can outline but not fully inhabit. And as we move southward now, back into the Arabian Peninsula, we encounter a variation on that same frustration. Not sculptures without archives, but inscriptions without definitive interpretation. Words, actual words, carefully carved into stone by people who intended them to be read and understood, whose full meaning continues to elude the scholars who have spent decades attempting to recover it. The Oasis of Tema sits in the northwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, in a broad, flat basin surrounded by low escarpments that create a natural gathering point for whatever water the surrounding terrain can offer. It is not a dramatic landscape in the way that volcanic fields or mountain ranges are dramatic. Its power is subtler, the power of water in a desert, of shade and cultivation in an environment where both are scarce, of a location that sits at the intersection of routes connecting the Mediterranean world, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the incense-producing regions of southern Arabia. That combination of water and position made Tama one of the most continuously significant sites in the entire Arabian Peninsula, across a span of human occupation that reaches back into the 2nd millennium BC and possibly earlier. Unlike many of the locations we have explored in this journey, sites whose importance was concentrated in a single period, whose significance has to be inferred from fragmentary evidence, Tama has a long, documented, multi-layered history that makes it simultaneously one of the best known and one of the most complex ancient sites in the region. It is precisely that complexity that generates the mystery. The site has produced inscriptions in multiple scripts and languages, reflecting its long occupation and its position at the crossroads of multiple cultural spheres. There are Aramaic inscriptions, some of considerable historical importance, including the famous Tama stone, now in the Louvre, which records a priestly donation in Aramaic and provides one of the earliest dated references to a deity worshipped at the site. There are inscriptions in ancient North Arabian scripts, the family of writing systems indigenous to the Arabian Peninsula that includes Datanitic, Tamanitic, and related varieties. There are inscriptions that scholars have tentatively associated with specific political periods. The Neo-Babylonian period, when the king Nabonidus famously resided at Tama for a decade, receives particular attention in the epigraphic record. But beneath all of this, underlying the relatively well-understood later layers, are inscriptions from the earliest temples at the site whose interpretation remains, in significant respects, unresolved. Picture the temple structures themselves. Tama has produced evidence of religious architecture dating back to at least the early 1st millennium BC, with some researchers arguing for cult activity at certain locations within the Oasis, reaching back considerably further. The earliest architectural phases of these structures are not always clearly separable from later rebuilding. But where the sequence can be established, the associated inscriptions present a set of challenges that standard epigraphic tools have not fully overcome. The challenges begin with script. The earliest inscriptions at Tama's temple sites include examples in what appears to be a transitional or hybrid writing tradition, signs that share characteristics with known ancient North Arabian scripts, but that do not map cleanly onto any single identified variety. This transitional character might reflect the site's position at a crossroads, where multiple scribal traditions were in contact and influencing each other. It might reflect the early development of a local script tradition that later standardized into something more recognizable. Or it might indicate that the inscriptions belong to a phase of writing at the site that is genuinely earlier than the known parallels, a phase whose conventions were established before the regional scripts coalesced into their documented forms. The dating problem compounds the interpretive one. Establishing the absolute age of stone inscriptions is methodologically difficult. Without clear stratigraphic association, without being able to say with confidence that a particular inscription was carved before a particular layer of occupation was deposited, relative and absolute chronologies remain approximate. Some of the early Tama inscriptions have been assigned dates based on paleographic comparison with dated inscriptions elsewhere, but paleographic dating carries its own uncertainties, particularly for scripts whose developmental sequences are not fully understood. What can be read, and what remains unclear. The later Aramaic inscriptions from Tama, including the Tama stone, are relatively well understood in linguistic terms, even where their historical interpretation involves uncertainty. The language is identifiable, the script is decipherable, and the content, while sometimes ambiguous in detail, can be characterized in general terms. The earlier inscriptions are different. Some of them use divine names or epithets that do not correspond straightforwardly to deities well attested elsewhere in the ancient Near Eastern record. A deity identified in certain Tama inscriptions as Psalm, a name related to concepts of peace, wholeness, or completion in Semitic linguistic traditions, appears to have been a significant object of cult at the site, but the specific character of this deity, the mythology associated with the cult, and the relationship of psalm worship at Tamai to related divine figures elsewhere in the ancient world remain matters of scholarly debate. There are also inscriptions that appear to record ritual or cultic activities in formulaic language whose precise meaning is unclear. The formulaic nature of the language, the use of standardized phrases and repeated structures, suggests that these are not casual or informal texts, but rather official dedications, ritual prescriptions, or administrative records of temple activity. The formulas, however, are not always paralleled in other inscriptions from the region in ways that would allow their content to be reconstructed from context. Some researchers have proposed that certain of the early Tama temple inscriptions preserve traces of a religious tradition significantly older than the first millennium BC context in which they are physically preserved. The conservative tendency of religious language, its resistance to change, its deliberate archaism, its function as a vehicle for tradition rather than innovation, means that inscriptions carved in the early first millennium might preserve formulaic language whose origins lie centuries earlier, in a cultic tradition whose Bronze Age roots have not been independently documented. If this is correct, the early Tama inscriptions might represent a window into a religious world considerably older than their physical form suggests. A preservation in stone of traditions that had been transmitted orally or in perishable written form across a long preceding period. The theological and ritual concepts encoded in those archaic formulas would then represent some of the oldest recoverable evidence for religious practice in the northwestern Arabian Peninsula. This is a hypothesis that the evidence supports suggestively rather than conclusively. The archaic quality of certain linguistic forms in the early Tama inscriptions is recognized by specialists in the relevant scripts and languages, but the interpretation of archaism as genuine antiquity, as opposed to deliberate stylistic conservatism in a later composition, requires arguments that the current evidence can frame, but not definitively settle. The Nabonidus period adds another layer of complexity. The Neo-Babylonian king who resided at Tama from approximately 553 to 543 BC, abandoning his capital Babylon for reasons that ancient sources found deeply puzzling and that modern scholars continue to debate, conducted significant building activity at the site and appears to have engaged with its existing religious traditions in ways that left traces in both the Babylonian and the local Arabian record. The relationship between Nabonidus's religious program, his controversial promotion of the moon god Sin, and the existing cult traditions at Tama, including the worship of Psalm and other local deities, is a question that touches directly on the interpretation of the earlier temple inscriptions. Did Nabonidus incorporate local Temanite religious traditions into his own theological framework? Did his presence at the site stimulate a renewal or elaboration of existing cultic practices that is reflected in the inscriptional record? Or did the Babylonian presence represent a disruption of local traditions that the inscriptional record captures only indirectly? These questions cannot be answered without a clearer understanding of what the earlier inscriptions actually say. And that understanding, for the most difficult and most significant of those inscriptions, has not yet been achieved. There are also inscriptions at Tama that have been identified, but not yet fully published. Texts known to exist from survey and excavation records, but whose detailed epigraphic analysis has not yet appeared in the scholarly literature. The pace of epigraphic publication is often slower than the pace of discovery, and it is entirely possible that material already recovered from the site contains evidence that would significantly advance the interpretation of the earliest temple inscriptions. A site occupied for 3,000 years, visited by a Babylonian king who found something there compelling enough to stay for a decade, home to a religious tradition whose divine figures do not entirely match what we know from neighboring cultures, and, at its oldest levels, inscriptions that we can see and touch but cannot fully read. What were the earliest worshippers at Tama's temples saying to their gods? What obligations were they recording? What rituals were they prescribing? What understanding of the sacred were they encoding in those carefully carved signs? The stone has kept the words. The meaning remains, for now, its own. The stone at Tama holds its meaning with the patient indifference of something that has already outlasted several civilizations and expects to outlast several more. Words carved into rock survive the people who carved them, survive the institutions that commissioned them, survive the languages in which they were composed, and wait with no particular urgency for the understanding that may or may not eventually arrive. But some ancient sites do not wait quietly. Some of them announce their endings in a register that requires no translation, no epigraphic expertise, no careful calibration of paleographic dating methods. Some sites speak in the universal language of fire and collapse and sudden, violent cessation. And the message, even across 3,000 years, is immediately and viscerally clear. Hassanlu is one of those sites. It sits in the Solduz Valley of northwestern Iran, near the southern shore of Lake Urmia, in a landscape of fertile agricultural plains ringed by mountains whose heights carry snow well into the spring. The valley is productive, well-watered, sheltered, capable of supporting substantial populations, and it has been occupied continuously, in one form or another, for thousands of years. The Tipe, the mounded tell that marks the accumulated debris of long occupation, rises above the surrounding plain with the quiet authority of a place that has seen everything the surrounding landscape has had to offer, across every season of human history that has passed through it. What makes Hassanlu extraordinary is not its longevity. Many sites in the ancient Near East were occupied for comparable durations. What makes it extraordinary is the moment at which one phase of its occupation ended, a moment so precisely preserved, so dramatically captured in the physical evidence, that archaeologists working on the site in the mid-20th century described it with an almost audible intake of breath. Sometime around 800 BC, Hassanlu burned. Not gradually. Not in the slow, incremental way that sites accumulate fire damage across generations of occupation. In a single catastrophic event, an attack, a destruction so rapid and so thorough that it froze the site in a moment of crisis with a completeness that has few parallels in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. The buildings of the upper citadel collapsed in the conflagration. Mud brick walls, heated to temperatures sufficient to partially vitrify the surface, slumped and fell. Roofs came down, sealing beneath them the contents of rooms exactly as they had been arranged at the moment the fire reached them. And beneath that destruction layer, archaeology found the ancient world caught in the act of living. Storage rooms with their contents intact, weapons in positions suggesting they had been seized and then dropped, ritual objects that appear to have been hastily gathered, taken from their normal storage locations and being carried toward an exit that was never reached. And most dramatically, in a burned corridor of what had been a substantial building, 3 human skeletons, 2 adults and what appears to have been a younger individual, in positions that suggested they had been moving together, carrying something, when the roof came down on them. What they were carrying was the gold bowl of Hassanlu. The bowl is now one of the most celebrated objects in the collection of the Archaeological Museum in Tehran, a vessel of extraordinary craftsmanship, decorated with mythological scenes and repoussé work of remarkable technical quality, whose iconographic program has generated decades of scholarly analysis and considerable interpretive disagreement. The scenes on the bowl appear to draw from multiple mythological traditions. Elements that recall Mesopotamian, Hurrian, and local Iranian iconographic conventions are present, combined in a composition whose specific narrative content has not been definitively identified. It was being carried through a burning building by people who were trying to save it, or to take it, when they died. That fact alone tells us something about the bowl's value to the people of Hassanlu, about the priorities that govern their actions in the final moments of their city's existence. But who attacked Hassanlu, and why? The historical context of the destruction, around 800 BC, in the region south of Lake Urmia, immediately suggests the Urartian kingdom as the most likely candidate. Urartu, centered further north and northwest around Lake Van, was at this period engaged in an aggressive program of territorial expansion that brought it into conflict with multiple polities across the highlands of eastern Anatolia and northwestern Iran. Assyrian sources document Urartian military activity in the general region of Hassanlu's location, and the scale and completeness of the Hassanlu destruction is consistent with a deliberate military assault rather than accidental fire or internal conflict. This Urartian attribution is the mainstream scholarly position, and it rests on reasonable circumstantial evidence. but it is not confirmed by direct documentation. No inscription, Urartian, Assyrian, or local, has been found that explicitly records an attack on Hassanlu at this period. The attribution rests on spatial proximity, chronological coincidence, and the character of the destruction rather than on unambiguous historical testimony. And the destruction, when examined in detail, raises questions that the simple Urartian conquest model does not fully answer. The site shows evidence not just of burning, but of systematic looting prior to or concurrent with the destruction. Storage areas that should have contained valuables were found empty or nearly so. The contents of certain rooms appear to have been selectively removed before the fire consumed the buildings. This pattern, selective looting followed by burning, suggests an attacking force that had time to search the site methodically before destroying it, which implies either a prolonged siege and assault or a level of prior knowledge about the site's layout and the location of its valuables that goes beyond what a simple raid would suggest. Some researchers have noted that the 3 individuals found with the gold bowl were not the only human remains in the destruction layer. Other skeletal remains, found in various locations across the burned citadel, were in positions and circumstances suggesting different fates. Some apparently killed in the assault, others possibly trapped by the structural collapse, others in configurations that have resisted straightforward interpretation. The human geography of the destruction is not simple, and it does not tell a single, coherent story of attack and defense. There is also the question of what Hassanlu was, what kind of political entity it represented, what its relationship was to the surrounding region, and why it warranted the kind of comprehensive destruction it apparently received. The site shows evidence of substantial wealth and organizational complexity. The columned halls of the upper citadel, the quality of the objects recovered from the destruction layer, the scale of the fortifications, all suggest a center of real political and economic significance. But the identity of the political entity centered on Hassanlu, its name in the historical sources, its relationships with neighboring powers, remains uncertain. Some researchers have associated Hassanlu with a polity mentioned in Assyrian sources in the region, possibly connected to the kingdom of Mannae, whose missing archives we explored earlier in this journey, or to one of the smaller highland kingdoms that the Assyrian texts mention in the context of their northwestern Iranian campaigns. The geographical proximity of Hassanlu to the territory associated with Mannae makes this association plausible, but it has not been established with the kind of direct evidence that would allow confident identification. The iconography of the gold bowl adds another dimension to the interpretive puzzle. If the scenes on the bowl represent a local mythological tradition, stories that the people of Hassanlu told about their gods and heroes, then the bowl is not just a precious object, but a document, a record of belief and narrative whose content reflects the intellectual world of a society that left no other textual testimony. The inability to definitively identify the mythological program of the bowl's decoration means that this potential testimony remains sealed, as frustrating in its way as the unread inscriptions of Tema or the missing archive of Bitbahiani. What language did the people of Hassanlu speak? What scripts, if any, did their scribes use? Why has no written material, not a single tablet, not a single inscribed object beyond the bowl itself, been recovered from a site of such evident sophistication? These questions have no current answers. The excavations at Hassanlu, conducted primarily by a University of Pennsylvania team under Robert Dyson across several decades of fieldwork, were thorough by the standards of their time and produced a foundational body of documentation. But the site is large, the investigated areas represent a portion of the total, and the specific questions that current scholarship would most like to answer were not always the questions that guided the earlier excavation strategy. Somewhere in the unexcavated portions of the tepe, beneath the burned and collapsed buildings of the catastrophic destruction level, there may be answers, in the form of archives, of inscriptions, of objects whose context would allow the identification that current evidence cannot support. 3 people died carrying a golden bowl through a burning building 3,000 years ago. We have the bowl. We have the burned building. We have the bones. What we do not have is their story, told in their own words, in their own language, from their own perspective. And that absence, in the end, may be the most eloquent thing the destruction layer has preserved. 3 people died in a burning building, carrying something precious toward an exit they never reached. We have the object. We have the ruins. We have the bones. But the story, the full, human, contextual story of what Hassanlu was, what it meant, who destroyed it and why, remains assembled only in outline, its interior still dark. That is the nature of what we have been tracing across this entire journey. Not the absence of the past, but its incompleteness. The presence of enough evidence to know that something significant happened, and not quite enough to know what it fully meant. And now we follow a different kind of trail. Not the trail of destruction, but the trail of commerce. Of the slow, patient movement of precious goods across one of the most demanding landscapes on Earth, and of the way stations, the stopping points, the small but essential nodes of infrastructure that made that movement possible, and that have, in ways that current archaeology has not fully explained, largely vanished from the physical record. The incense route. Even the name carries a certain weight, the suggestion of something ancient, aromatic, and slightly beyond the reach of ordinary historical imagination. But strip away the romance and what remains is logistics. The movement of frankincense and myrrh from their production zones in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa to their consumption markets in the Mediterranean world, Mesopotamia, and Egypt was for roughly 1,000 years beginning around the 8th or 9th century BC, one of the most economically significant trade flows in the ancient world. The resins were not luxuries in the casual sense of the word. They were religious necessities, required for temple ritual across every major ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean religious tradition, consumed in quantities that made the trade that supplied them structurally important to the economies and institutions of every civilization that participated in it. The route that carried these goods northward through the Arabian Peninsula is, in its broad outline, one of the better documented aspects of ancient Arabian commercial geography. Ancient sources, Greek, Roman, and to a lesser extent Babylonian and South Arabian, provide enough information to sketch the general corridor, up through the Hejaz and Hejaz highlands along the western side of the peninsula, passing through or near major oasis centers including Najran, Tema, Dedan, and Hegra, before branching toward Palestine, Syria, and the Gulf Coast. The broad route is not in dispute. What is in dispute, or rather what remains deeply unclear, is the detailed geography of the route during its earliest phases, and specifically the fate of the way stations that must have existed along it during those early centuries of operation. Picture what a way station on the ancient incense route would have needed to be. A caravan moving northward from southern Arabia with a cargo of frankincense covered enormous distances across terrain that offered water and shade at unpredictable and often widely spaced intervals. The animals, primarily camels, whose domestication and deployment as long-distance pack animals was itself a technological development that made the overland incense trade possible, required water at intervals that could not exceed several days. The human personnel required water, food, security, and the kind of institutional infrastructure that allowed commercial transactions to be conducted, disputes to be resolved, and goods to be transferred between different caravan operators working different sections of the route. A way station that served these needs was not a casual arrangement. It was a physical installation, with wells or cisterns, with storage facilities, with accommodation of some kind, and with the social and institutional apparatus of a community that derived its livelihood from servicing the traffic that passed through it. Such installations, once established and operating, would have developed their own permanence, their own local populations, their own investment in the continuation of the trade that sustained them. And in the northern Arabian section of the route, the stretch between the well-documented oasis centers and the better-known Nabatean infrastructure that eventually formalized and dominated the trade from roughly the 4th century BC onward, these earlier way stations are extraordinarily difficult to find. The Nabatean period is relatively well documented archaeologically. The Nabatean kingdom, centered on Petra in modern Jordan, developed the incense route infrastructure to a high degree of sophistication, and the physical remains of Nabatean way stations, caravanserais, and water management systems are identifiable across a considerable section of the route's northern reaches. Some of these sites are well excavated and well understood, but the Nabateans did not invent the route. They inherited it, formalized it, and monetized it with characteristic efficiency. But the commercial traffic they managed had been flowing northward for centuries before Nabatean political organization gave it its most archaeologically visible form. The pre-Nabatean infrastructure, the way stations of the 8th, 7th, 6th, and 5th centuries BC, the period when the incense trade was already economically significant, but before the Nabateans had emerged as its dominant managers, is represented in the physical record by almost nothing. The mainstream explanation for this absence points to the nature of early way station construction. Before the investment of major political entities like the Nabatean kingdom in route infrastructure, way stations may have been modest, semi-permanent installations, tents and temporary shelters rather than masonry structures, cisterns dug rather than lined with stone, installations whose physical footprint was small enough to be easily missed in survey and rapidly degraded by time and weather. A way station that consisted primarily of a reliable water source, a cleared camping area, and the accumulated knowledge of local guides about where to find both would leave almost no archaeological trace, particularly after 2.5 millennia of subsequent use and modification of the same water sources. There is also the possibility of deliberate obscurity. The incense trade was enormously profitable, and the communities that managed specific sections of it had strong incentives to maintain control over the route knowledge, specifically knowledge of water sources, that gave them their commercial leverage. Greek and Roman sources comment with some frustration on the unwillingness of Arabian traders to share precise route information with outsiders, noting that this informational control was itself a commercial asset. Way stations whose locations were known only to initiated participants in the trade network would not have been marked in ways that would make them obvious to outsiders, or to archaeologists working 2,500 years later. Some researchers have approached the problem from a different direction, working not from the surface archaeology of the route itself, but from the textual record of ancient sources that mention specific stopping points. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, Strabo's geographical descriptions, Pliny's account of the incense trade. These and other ancient sources occasionally mention place names along the Arabian route that have not been identified with known sites. Some of these unidentified toponyms may correspond to way station sites that exist in the landscape but have not been recognized as such, either because they have not been surveyed or because their physical remains are too modest to have attracted attention. The correspondence between ancient place names and physical sites in northwestern Arabia is an ongoing scholarly project that has made progress in recent decades, but remains far from complete. Saudi archaeological survey work, expanded significantly in recent years, has identified numerous sites along and adjacent to the incense route corridor that merit investigation. Sites that show surface evidence consistent with habitation during the relevant periods, but that have not been excavated or even systematically documented. There is also a question about the relationship between the incense route way stations and the broader pattern of tribal territorial organization in northern Arabia. The route did not pass through a political vacuum. The tribal confederations of northern Arabia, some of whose names appear in Assyrian sources in the context of campaigns into the region and in later Arabian historical traditions, controlled the territories through which the route passed, and their management of access to water and safe passage was an essential component of the trade infrastructure. The way stations may have been, in many cases, not fixed installations, but rather the territories and encampments of specific tribal groups whose hospitality services were institutionalized into the commercial system. If this is correct, the archaeological invisibility of the early way stations reflects not a failure of construction, but a different relationship between commercial infrastructure and physical permanence, one in which the essential services were provided by mobile or semi-mobile communities whose material traces do not conform to the fixed site model that archaeological survey is optimized to detect. What happened to these communities, and to the institutional knowledge they carried, when the Nabatean consolidation of the route gradually displaced the earlier, more distributed management system. Were they absorbed into the Nabatean commercial structure? Did they relocate, or adapt, or resist? The Nabatean sources, themselves not abundant, do not address this transition in ways that illuminate the fate of the earlier system. The route is still there, running northward through the Arabian landscape, its general corridor defined by the same geographical logic that determined it 3,000 years ago. The water sources that define the stopping points are, many of them, still in use. What lies beneath the accumulated centuries of use at those water sources? What evidence of the earliest way stations, of the communities that first formalized the stops, first dug the cisterns, first established the institutional arrangements that made long-distance camel caravan trade across the Arabian interior viable, remains in the ground, waiting for the excavation that has not yet been conducted? The route remembers where the water is. It does not yet tell us who was there first. The incense smoke dispersed, and the roads that carried it fell silent, and the way stations that made those roads survivable dissolved back into the desert floor with the quiet efficiency that only time and wind can achieve. We have been following, throughout this exploration, the traces of ancient systems, commercial, administrative, religious, military, whose physical remnants are either missing entirely or present in forms too fragmentary to fully interpret. And each time we have arrived at that threshold between what the evidence shows and what it withholds, the same question has reasserted itself in different forms. Who were these people really? Not as they appear in the records of their neighbors and adversaries, not as they are reflected in the administrative texts of empires that saw them primarily as tributaries, obstacles, or commercial partners, but as they understood themselves, their own name for their own world, their own account of their own significance. That question takes its sharpest form when we turn to a people who appear repeatedly across nearly 3 centuries of Neo-Assyrian campaign records, under a name that carries the unmistakable weight of self-designation: the Arabi. They appear first in the annals of Shalmaneser III in the 9th century BC, and continue to surface in Assyrian records through the reigns of Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, a span of documented contact stretching from approximately 853 BC to the mid-7th century BC. That duration alone is significant. The Assyrians did not maintain 3 centuries of administrative attention on a people who were not consistently relevant to imperial concerns. The Arabi recur in the record because they recurred in Assyrian experience, as military adversaries, as tribute-paying subordinates, as suppliers of camels essential to desert logistics, and as the controlling presence in territory that the Assyrian Empire wanted to manage but never fully subdued. The Assyrian texts describe Arabi leaders, and unusually, with a frequency that has attracted scholarly attention, they describe Arabi queens. Female rulers appear in the Assyrian record of Arabian engagement with a prominence that has no close parallel in the contemporary documentation of neighboring polities. Whether these women were queens in the full political sense, or ritual leaders whose authority was specifically religious rather than broadly political, or something that the Assyrian administrative vocabulary was not well equipped to categorize. These are questions that the Assyrian sources raise without resolving, because Assyrian scribes described what they encountered without always understanding its internal logic. But where did the Arabi live? Where was the center of whatever political organization sustained their 3-century presence in the Assyrian record? This is the question that has no satisfactory answer. The Arabi are consistently associated in the sources with the northern Arabian desert, the broad zone stretching from the Syro-Arabian steppe southward into the Nafud and beyond. They are a desert people in the Assyrian imagination, associated with camels, with mobility, with the kind of military capability that derives from intimate knowledge of terrain that settled armies find nearly impassable. But mobility does not preclude having a center. Pastoral and semi-nomadic societies in the ancient world typically maintained fixed points, seasonal encampments that became effectively permanent, Oasis settlements that served as administrative and commercial anchors for wider-ranging pastoral territories, sacred sites that functioned as gathering places for groups whose everyday movements were dispersed. The Arabi had such a center. The Assyrian sources hint at it without locating it clearly. There are references to Arabi settlements, to places where tribute was paid and diplomatic meetings occurred, to locations that the Assyrian military sought to reach and occasionally did reach during punitive campaigns into the desert. But the texts provide geographical information in terms that resist confident translation onto a modern map. Distances measured in days of march, directional references anchored to landmarks that have not been identified, place names whose relationship to known sites remains uncertain. Several candidate locations have been proposed by researchers working on this problem. Some scholars have argued for a location in the Wadi Sirhan, the long, low basin that cuts through the basalt desert of northern Arabia and connects the Syrian steppe to the Jawf region further south. The Wadi Sirhan is a natural corridor through otherwise difficult terrain, and its scattered oases would have provided the combination of water, pasture, and route-controlling position that an Arabi administrative center would require. The region has not been systematically surveyed for Iron Age occupation, and the possibility that significant archaeological remains exist in this zone cannot be dismissed. Others have pointed to the Taimah region, whose complex, multi-period occupation we have already explored in this journey, as a potential anchor point for Arabi political organization. Taimah's position at the intersection of multiple routes, its reliable water supply, and its documented importance during precisely the period when the Arabi appear most prominently in the Assyrian record, make it a plausible candidate for at least one significant Arabi settlement, if not the capital itself. A third school of thought has proposed that the search for a single Arabi capital may be misconceived, that the political organization of the Arabi was not centered on a fixed urban location, but was instead organized around a network of seasonal gathering points, sacred sites, and oasis settlements whose collective function was equivalent to a capital without any single node being architecturally or administratively dominant. This model of distributed political authority, which we encountered earlier in the discussion of the forgotten Oasis kingdom of the Neo-Assyrian campaigns, has genuine ethnographic and historical support in the context of Arabian pastoral societies. If the Arabi operated on this distributed model, the search for a capital is asking the wrong question of the evidence. The right question would be about the network, its nodes, its seasonal rhythms, its mechanisms of collective decision-making and resource management. And that question is considerably harder to answer from the combination of hostile external sources and incomplete archaeology that currently constitutes the evidentiary base. The archaeological situation in the northern Arabian interior during the relevant period, roughly the 9th through 7th centuries BC, is characterized by exactly the kind of incomplete coverage that we have encountered repeatedly in this exploration. Survey work has identified sites with Iron Age occupation across the region, but the density and quality of investigation varies enormously. Some areas have been walked systematically and their surface evidence documented. Others have been visited briefly, or not at all. The result is a map of known sites that reflects the distribution of archaeological effort as much as it reflects the actual distribution of ancient settlement. Satellite remote sensing has begun to fill some of these gaps. Multispectral analysis of the northern Arabian interior has revealed patterns of ancient land use, agricultural terracing, water management features, possible structural remains, in areas that ground survey had not previously documented. Some of these patterns are in locations consistent with the geographical parameters suggested by the Assyrian sources for Arabi territory. None has yet been confirmed as an Arabi site through excavation and material culture analysis. The material culture question is itself problematic. What would an Arabi site look like archaeologically? The Arabi, as a pastoral and semi-nomadic people, would not necessarily have produced the kind of dense, stratified occupation deposit that makes sites visible in survey and identifiable in excavation. Their settlements, if permanently occupied, might have been architecturally modest. Tent compounds with minimal permanent construction, organized around water sources whose archaeological signature is primarily the absence of stratigraphy rather than its presence. Identifying such sites requires a different investigative approach from the one that has successfully located and excavated the urban centers of ancient Mesopotamia and the Levant. It requires attentiveness to the archaeological signatures of mobility, the patterns of site distribution across a landscape, the relationship between sites and water sources, the material evidence of long-distance exchange that even highly mobile communities generate when they are integrated into broader commercial networks. The Arabi were integrated into those networks. They supplied camels to the Assyrian military. They controlled sections of the incense route. They received and sometimes refused to pay tribute denominated in the luxury goods of the ancient Near East. Their material engagement with the wider world was substantial enough to leave traces, in their own territory as well as in the Assyrian administrative record. Those traces are in the ground somewhere in the northern Arabian interior, in the unwalked sections of the Wadi Sirhan, in the unsurveyed approaches to Taimah, in the broad zones between known sites where the logic of water distribution and route geography suggests that human occupation must have concentrated. The queens of the Arabi negotiated with Assyrian kings. Their people moved camels across the desert with a precision that imperial logistics envied and depended upon. They sustained a political identity across 3 centuries of pressure from the most formidable military power of their age. And then, as Assyrian power contracted and the political map of the Near East reorganized in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the Arabi as a named entity fade from the record, absorbed perhaps into the broader Aramaic and Arabian cultural landscape that replaced the imperial system within which they had been visible. Where was the center of that world? And in the unmarked desert between the known sites, what remains of the people who once made the Assyrian Empire take careful notice of the Arabian interior? The camels are gone. The queens are gone. The capital, if there was one, is somewhere in that vast and patient landscape, waiting for the question to arrive at the right coordinates.